Come on, I feel like I've
It's
seen
been so
you-
long.
I've seen you guys over Zoom, but it's very different when you're like live and in person. And I know
You
some
were
of
in
you-
my valuation class.
I'm-
last-
Yes.
You're in it right
No,
now?
Yeah,
Okay,
I always sit on the third row.
okay.
Yeah, so I think we have. So we have 3 more people. I'm hoping they're here pretty soon.
We'll wait for a couple minutes.
So-
So do we go all the way through 12:30? Do they get a
You're-
break? What do
you
they
can
do?
You're in charge, so you have the room up until 12:30, but it's. Actually, I'm headed to attend a Zoom seminar. I'm giving a seminar. I would have to, they know I like to sit in, just, I learned even when it's the same, like Jonathan Haidt was last semester, and even when he's doing kind of similar topic, I don't think that's. Instead, I'm gonna be talking about, you guys know the meat and flavor.
Mhm.
So. But, all right, we're almost there with people. So are you teaching this semester? You are.
The only time I'm in New York is when I teach, so. Spring is my teaching
And
semester.
then you're in San Diego.
And even during the spring, I go back and forth.
Okay.
So this happened to be a weekend I wasn't going back, so.
I feel like I must have asked you this before. Are you a Padres fan or you follow baseball?
I'm a
Okay,
Yankees fan.
Padres are
I'm a
good this year.
Yankees fan. Their Padres are good. They've spent a lot of money. Let's not call them good yet.
I
They've
know.
spent an insane amount of money to be good, but let's see if they can actually be good. So
I like their own.
Yeah.
Here's something.
San Diego's not been blessed with good owners, so.
I know.
The Chargers. Disaster. So.
I'm showing my.
Are you
mind.
native San Diego?
I'm a twin, so I'm a longtime Cubs season ticket holder,
Okay,
but as of.
so you
12
know the meaning of pain and suffering, so.
It's achieved us and then went back and I had.
I think the worst thing that could happen to the Cubs was winning the World Series because it meant that you didn't have the trauma holding you together that you used to, so.
Right, well, and then if you added the Ricketts were really good at getting us to winning, but now they've kind of like
Yeah, given up.
salary dumps and their politics are not. But I'm a twin, so my sister and my family have been season ticket holders to the Padres for the
You
past.
must really hate the Yankees then, right?
Yeah.
We get you every single time.
We do, but I have hope. I have hope.
You have to have it, in fact, that's the
Yeah.
definition of. it.
It's glory. And I do the Jonathan Haidt rule. When I go to a Cubs or a Padres game, my phone goes in my pocket and I do not bring it out. So like, did you see that picture of when LeBron James broke the record?
Mhm.
And Bill Knight, the founder of Nike, was sitting there taking in the moment, but everybody else had their phone up like this.
You see that all the time, right? I mean, it's, you see pictures of fans of the game, they're not watching the game, they're watching
They're obsessed.
themselves watching the game. It's like, some weird.
Yeah, in the moment, so. All right, well, I won't take up any more of Professor Demotoran's time in part because I know you guys are eager for this one. But I'm grateful he's here. I'm always grateful when he joins us. You guys will have to report back on this since I can't. do the whole one.
They'll report the trauma they feel.
I'm sure. I know some of you already know him from being in his class and that's the thing, but he's always one of the most requested. So on the front end, but always when I do the postmortem, everyone's like, oh, we could have done with multiple Professor Demotoran sessions. So savor it today. I say this, that's kind of the theme of all spring. You guys hear me say this. This is our first in-person one. I know it's your last semester here, so savor this class. And thanks for getting here on time. And I will be in the building. I'll just be up on Zoom. So if there's some sort of snafu when you need me, you know how to reach me. And with that, have a good weekend too. All
Take
right,
care, Mary.
bye people.
Okay, so let's go around. It's a small group. I almost never get the luxury of talking to 9 people. And I've been stuck in Paulson now for 20-something years. So you're in my class this semester. Shivi, you've never been in.
I've
my
never
class.
been in your class.
Okay,
I'm in BPE,
what's your name?
Prabha,
I'm sorry, what is it?
Prabha,
But what did you say you were in something?
oh, BPE, Business and Political Economy.
I have no idea what acronyms mean, so you can skip them with me. So what does that mean if you're in BPE?
It's another program, so it's not a business, BS in business program, it's like.
This is political.
Yeah, it's
So
like a
you
separate-
have classes that cross across. the
No, it's all
business.
in start, it's a different.
So they
BPE
just
program.
concocted an acronym and made it different. Okay, I get it. What's your name?
Class one from.
Why do you put your And everybody here is a senior, right?
Yeah.
You've been in my class, right? So I recognize you. And you've never been in my class? What about you? Nikhil and Akhil, right? Okay. And Eunice. Eunice, you've been in my class? Yeah,
I was also in.
you were also in my class. You never showed up, then you showed up on Zoom, is that?
Showed up, I was just-
Okay. Okay. So today I am going to talk about something that cuts to the core of your existence. About 10 years ago, I came to a point where I lost my censoring mechanism. So I said, whatever's on my mind. And I'm still going to say some incredibly mean things about things you're taught as holy water now in business schools that I think is complete rubbish. So it cuts to the core of what a business is. So let's start at the beginning, right? You have a business as old as time. If you're a business, one of the basic questions you focus on is, what's the end game for a business? What are we trying to do in a business? Anybody want to give a shot? You will start a business. Don't read my slide. When you start a business, what's your end game? What are you trying to do? Yes. Fulfill some needs. That's just half a business. For you to continue as a business, in returning for fulfilling those needs, what do you hope to get in return? You're not Mother Teresa, right? Mother Teresa didn't run a business. She was open about it. She made a pact. I'll fulfill needs. I'll get heaven in return. That's fine. You run a business. You see a need that you think is not being met adequately. You create a product or service to fill that need. You get paid for it. And from whatever you get paid for it, you meet your costs, you take the difference. We call that a profit. It somehow become this bad word, but that's, and then you continue to make your product, maybe bigger, more lucrative. That's always been the end game of a business, is to provide a product or service that meets a need. So whenever I hear a CEO of a company say that the end game for his business is to transform a country, my antenna starts quivering. I can understand people wanting to transform countries, but if you have Paytm, stop talking about what your end game is, that you make India a better place. I'm not saying it's, you don't want that, but that's never been the end game of a business. And that strikes somebody as too narrow. That a business is focused on providing a product or service and getting paid. And the last 20 years, but this has always been true, there's been a pushback saying, there must be a bigger need, a bigger objective here. This doesn't seem like it should be enough. And there are three broad movements that have pushed back against just deliver a product or service, get paid for it, make the difference. Think of this as the Milton Friedman view of the world. 1971 New York Times article, if you go and read it, it's the most read piece of all of Milton Friedman's writings. Was a 1971 article about what the end game for a business should be. He said, look, it's very simple. You start a business, you try to make money, you try to grow. And if you create social benefits, great, but that's not the end game. So the pushback form takes three forms. One is that making it about profits and value is not enough. We should make businesses sustainable. I'll be quite honest. I have no idea what this word even means. There's an entire center I walked down on the 8th floor called the Center for Sustainable Business. One of these days, I will get the courage to actually walk in there and say, what the hell are you guys doing in here? So the first word I'm going to take on is this word sustainability. What the heck does it mean? Where is it going to lead? And what are we trying to accomplish? So that's one push. The second is that this is so selfish that in traditional business, we care about owners. Remember, shareholders is just an extension, that owners get focused on what they make, that there are other stakeholders in the business. Is that true? Absolutely, right? You have employees, you have suppliers, you have customers, you have society. You even have competitors, they're stakeholders as well. Their stake is that you fail, but they're still stakeholders. There are other stakeholders. And why are you ignoring them all? Basically, when we expand from shareholders to stakeholder, if you ever heard the word stakeholder wealth maximization in any of your classes, That's basically what they're talking about. Let's care about everybody. I call this the kumbaya objective, where you get around a campfire, you dance around, and say, we're going to make everybody happy. And then, of course, in the last 14 years, you've seen this concoction called ESG. So I'll tell you upfront what I think about ESG. If a concept can be both toxic and empty at the same time, ESG pulls it off. The way I describe ESG is it's a concept. It's not an idea because ideas have more depth to them. It's a concept that was born in sanctimony, nurtured with hypocrisy, and sold with sophistry. When ESG dies, and I hope it'll be soon, that should be what goes on its tombstone. Born in sanctimony, nurtured in hypocrisy, sold with sophistry. So today's class is about taking on what I call the Theocratic Trifecta. And I use those words intentionally. Trifecta because there are three concepts. What's the essence of the word theocratic? Iran is a theocratic republic, right? I don't know whether republic is the right word. There's an Ayatollah. It says this is right, this is wrong. Women have to cover their head, they can't drive. Theocratic trifecta. The essence of a theocracy is there's an all-knowing person at the top who then tells the rest of us what you can or cannot do. And this is not about logic or it's not up for debate. And I use the word theocratic because the people who push these ideas believe that they're on the side of good. And you're in a very dangerous place if you start with the presumption that your goodness and everybody who argues with you must therefore be bad. The first post I wrote on ESG in 2019, I started the post by saying, look, I'm going to say what I think about ESG. And as you read this, you're going to classify me as a moral troglodyte, but I'm okay with that. Because the notion that you push back against what's good for the earth seems almost, what kind of person are you? Do you have pictures of Jeffrey Dahmer hanging up in your house? I mean, there was the vision they have of somebody pushing back, they must be on the wrong side. So I'm going to take each of these and kind of disentangle them. But I'm going to take you through a very quick review of what you probably should already know, that you should have learned in your corporate finance class. I haven't taught corporate finance to the undergraduates in 15 years, I think, because I now teach the valuation class in this. Now I said, look, pick one. I'll do one or the other, and they pick the valuation class. But to be honest, I wish they'd pick the corporate finance class because it's a core class. It's a one class that I think everybody in business school should take. It might not be taught the way it should be, but to me, corporate finance is about the first principles that govern how to run a business. Everything else feeds into it. But the MBAs take my corporate finance class in the first year, my valuation class in the second year, and they often ask me, what's the difference between the two classes? I teach the same class, I give them different names, less work for me. But technically, that's not true. The way I describe the difference between the two classes in corporate finance, you're looking at businesses from the inside out. You're an owner, you're a manager, you're saying, how do I run a business? In valuation, you're looking at the same businesses from the outside in. You value a company, you're making judgments, but you're not running the business, somebody else is. So I'm going to take you on a very quick review of my corporate finance class. Might not be the corporate finance class you got, but this is my corporate finance class. I describe my corporate finance class as a big picture class. So very early in the class, I set on the table the reality that every business has multiple stakeholders. And especially if it's a publicly traded company, the number of, everybody, even if it's a private business, has multiple stakeholders, but with publicly traded companies have added stakeholders. So let's take a publicly traded company. Let's go through the list of stakeholders and let's look at what their relationship is to the company. Let's start with shareholders. What do shareholders do in a publicly traded company?
They put their money into the company.
But and in return, what do they get promised?
They expect a return.
Expect. There's no promise, right? Basically, you invest in the equity of a company, you get a residual claim. At least in theory, you're entitled to whatever's left over after every other claim holder needs have been met. So shareholders supply capital. And because they get a residual claim, they need to get somebody to run the business, right? Because otherwise there'll be no residual claim. Think of what happens in universities. How much excess money do they have at the end of every year? Oh, they don't. What the heck happens? Because there's no residual claim. If there's too much money, you know what they do? They just spend the money. So shareholders, in theory, hire managers. But what are the two mechanisms they use to keep managers in line? One is the annual meeting, right? Once a year, you get together and you tell managers, guys, you're doing a terrible job. The other is, well, they don't set the compensation. They're dependent on who? The board of directors, right? In a publicly traded company, because of it's just the sheer logistics of it. How do you get 100,000 people together and decide a compensation package for Bob Iger? You hire, and in theory, the board of directors works for the shareholders. Their job is to protect shareholder interests. And the CEO is supposed to come from the board, and the board is going to keep them honest. Now, we can debate how much power shareholders actually have in either mechanism. But at least in theory, that's the shareholder claim. Let's move on to lenders. Lenders can include banks, they can include bondholders. What's the nature of their relationship? What do they do? They lend money. They're promised. There's a contractual claim, right? And the contractual claim is in the form of interest payments, and the bankers can also write covenants. You can't do this, you can't do this, right? Protections. There's a contractual claim, they get interest and principal payments, and sometimes they can get veto power over decisions, right? If they're big enough. Let's move on to employees. What's the nature of what they do? Without them, company can't exist, right? Can you imagine Amazon without Amazon drivers? Your packages will all go to some kind of a warehouse somewhere. I don't even know that they can get to the warehouse. They'll be stuck at the airport that they come in on. Clearly, employees are the lubricant that makes companies run. But unless it's a slave labor environment, let's not talk about those companies because some of those might have existed in time. Why do they do it?
Compensation.
For compensation. And there's a wage contract, right? Now we can debate whether the weakness of unions has led to those wage contracts becoming less or more attractive. But there's a contract that holds employees, you're a customer to a company. What's the nature of your relationship with the company? You buy things from them, and do they ask for something in return? Unless you have a stupid user-based company which says, let me give it to you because I want users, they want something from you. And if what they've sold you doesn't meet some requirements, there's an implicit contract, right? Because it's governed by consumer protection laws. And if you're Amazon, you don't even have to tell them what's wrong. You just drop it in the Dropbox. But there is an implicit contract between you. You can already see the foundations for what I'm laying, right? What about society? Society is this big, fuzzy, amorphous group. So it takes a form of governments. If it's a if it's a democracy, you elected the government then sets tax laws and regulations based on what it believes is good for. It's trying to cut off externalities, right? That's a word that we use in economics for businesses create side costs, and it's society's job to keep those externalities off. So again, there's a relationship, right? Which is society sets the rules, you play by the rules, you then benefit from being part of a lawful, orderly society. Competitors don't have any contractual claims. They're trying to take your market away and you're trying to take their market away. But technically they're stakeholders too, right? So I start with that. And then I lay out the big picture of corporate finance. I'm going to show you the one page that I show my corporate finance class in the very first session. And I tell them, look, if you get this page, the rest of the class is icing on the cake. It's one page summarizes the key principles in corporate finance. So we'll get to that page. But in looking at these stakeholders, before I show you what the first principles are, I've got to decide which stakeholder I'm going to pick. You say, why do you have to pick one? I'll come back and talk about why you can't have multiple stakeholders. I mean, it's a basic operations research problem. When you can have one objective and multiple constraints, but you can't have multiple objectives and one constraint, right? It's just the nature of the beast. And in traditional corporate finance, we put one of these stakeholder groups on top, which is shareholders. I've already laid the foundation for why. But I want you to tell me, because you're going to run into why can't we, why focus on shareholders? Why do we focus on shareholders? Is it because they're special people? Is it because we're greedy capitalists? What is it about shareholders that leads us to put them on top? Eunice, you want to try? What is it about shareholders that leads us to put them on top?
Which shareholders? The equity holders?
There's only one shareholder, right? There are no other shareholders. As opposed shareholder, so yeah, the stakeholders can have share. Why do we put shareholders on top?
How like leverage our.
That's such a weak argument. Now you can see why stakeholder wealth maximization gets its footing, right? Because that seems kind of arbitrary.
What about the stakeholders? They're the only ones that are promised, that are not promised. to
They're the only ones without a contractual claim. Lenders are worried about a company, they can tight covenants, they can charge a higher interest rate. Employees are worried about working for a company, they can leave and go work for somebody else or demand protection in terms of if I lose my job, what'll happen. Shareholders have a residual claim. Let me ask you a question. If you're a shareholder in a business, and I say you're just one of many stakeholders, who's looking out for the residual claim? How will there even be a residual claim, right? Because you're going to take the pie, you're going to split it among the groups, and you're going to say, there's nothing left for you, nothing left for you, nothing left for you. We put shareholders on top, not because they're special people, but because they're the only stakeholder group without a contractual claim. Imagine a world where there were no shareholders. You'd have to have the government run everything, right? And we've had that experiment. It's not gone particularly well. The reason we put shareholders on top is not because they're special. It's because of residual claim. And here we run into a practical problem, which is if your job, when you make decisions, is to maximize shareholder wealth in some fuzzy form, how do you measure it? What do you come up with? You had a question?
Yeah, I was just kind of wondering, like, so I feel like shareholders are put first slightly because they're the ones.
They're not put first slightly. Let me be very clear. They're put categorically front and center. So this is not, oh, they're a little milder. This is it. They're the lead players here. Everybody else is, in a sense, a constraint on the system of feeding into the lead player.
Right. I chose one. I was gonna say, I think it's slightly because.
Why do you like the word slightly? Let's take the word slightly out. Be decisive. It's because
I don't want to give an incorrect statement, but I feel like the people who own the company are the people on the board, the shareholders. A lot of the
No, wait.
biggest shareholders on the board.
Do you own shares in the company at all? Any company?
Yeah.
No. Are you on the board?
No, because.
No, but wait,
No.
you're not on the board.
No.
Do you know anybody on the board?
No, it's not.
Right. Did you remember voting for any of these people on the board? Okay. So there we have if you're a large publicly traded company, if you're an Apple shareholder, first, your link to the board is very, very tenuous, right? Because it's a $2 trillion company. I don't know how rich you are, but you're not owning 10% of a $2 trillion company. If you're lucky, you're owning 0.00001%, right? You're one of a horde of people in the company. So technically, you're right. The board of directors is voted on by the shareholders. So you have a say. But I said those mechanisms tend to be weak, but your say is relatively, it's tiny. Other people who own more of the company than you do? Who are the largest shareholders in Apple? No, or Buffalo. Warren Buffett doesn't even make the top 15 list. It's institutional investors, BlackRock, State, not because they're particularly, they like Apple, but because they're index funds and you have the largest market cap companies. The same reason the Adani Group is in BlackRock and Vanguard. It's not like somebody in Pennsylvania said, oh, let's go buy the Adani Group. It's this nice company. It's an index fund. And if you're a $200 billion company trading in India, you're going to be a big part of the India portion of the index fund. The largest investors in the company tend to be institutional investors. They must have a big say in the board, right? What do most institutional investors do when they don't like the way a company is run? I would love to say that. If you're Fidelity or your Vanguard or your BlackRock, do you have the energy to fight? I mean, remember, they own shares in thousands and thousands of companies. This fighting management is an extraordinarily resource-intensive exercise. Do you know what most institutional investors do? They vote with their feet. Dump the stock market. They sell and they move on, right? I don't like the way Disney's run. I'm going to sell and move on. You know that 94% of the time, institutional investors vote with incumbent managers. So the board of directors, the names don't come from somewhere else. They come from within the company or within the existing board. And they put out 9 names, 10 names. You've never heard of any of them. And they say, this is like a Russian election. Would you like Putin or would you like Putin? Or you don't like Putin? Then we have a place for you, right? This is an election where essentially the game is loaded because the institutional investors vote along with incumbent managers because it's too much energy to fight. It's not some conspiracy. They just can't do it. Individual investors just don't show up because they don't think they make a difference. So board of directors end up being rubber stamps rather than being an entity that protects shareholders. Guess what they become? They become an entity whose job it is to play defense for the CEO. They're the first line of defense. So the shareholders get put first, at least in theory. Whether managers actually deliver on that is an entirely different question, right? Because if you feel shareholders have little power over you as managers, remember, you have your own interests, right? You want to build the biggest company ever. You want to run an empire. You want to move your headquarters closer to Aspen because you like to ski. You're going to put your interests over theirs. It's called corporate governance. We've had that fight now for 50 years as to how do we increase the say that shareholders and companies have in how the company is run. But at least in theory, shareholder value gets put first. And here we have a practical question. If I told managers your job is to maximize shareholder value, I have a measurement follow-up I need to do, right? To see if the management has done a good job, I need to come back at the end of the year and see how much did value go up by. I'll give you 2 options and you tell me which one you're going to take. One is you could hire McKinsey or Goldman Sachs to come in and value a company at the end of every year. It's expensive. They'll come in and praise value. Trust me, if you pay enough money, they will give you a number. What's the problem with that? He who pays the piper calls the tune. So you hire Goldman Sachs, you're the management, tell me a value, you're going to get a bias. It's not because they're bad people again, it's because they have their own self-interest. So praise values, nobody believes them. In real estate, you see this all the time. People make, essentially, there's no money behind it. But if the company is publicly traded, there's another alternative, right? Which is the market's estimate of what you're worth. Do markets make mistakes? God, do they make some huge mistakes? But they have 2 things going for them. One is it's continuous, right? You can look at what the market, so if a company announces a big acquisition, Microsoft says it's going to buy Activision. You listen to management of the 2 companies, what do they tell you about the merger? Most amazing merger ever. We're going to conquer the metaverse. You say, what's the metaverse? We can't tell you it, but we're going to conquer it. We'll tell you once we've done it. So if you listen to managers and acquisitions, every deal is the greatest deal on the face of the earth, right? You're in half of all acquisitions. the stock price of the acquiring company drops on the announcement of an acquisition. So what's the market saying? We don't believe you guys. You're paying too much. Now, managers' response is they don't know as much as we do. That's true, right? Managers have access to internal forecasts from the target company. They're banker after banker coming and doing forecasts of synergy. And often people say managers know more than shareholders. Why should I go with shareholders? If managers were right about mergers, especially friendly mergers, what percentage of them should work? 100%? You know, about 25% of mergers are value creating and about 75% destroy value. You know what? I'll take my chances in the market. It might be screwed up, but it has no ego. Markets, you get continuous reaction. So now you see in practice why maximizing shareholder value often becomes maximizing stock prices. Because it's not because people think markets are perfect, but because the alternatives. Do you want to trust accountants instead? I wouldn't. I'll take market mistakes over accounting mistakes every single time. So if you look at the big picture of corporate finance, it's built around the premise that the objective of a business is to maximize its value. Remember the other class I teach is valuation. A couple of you have been in that class. What's the value of a business? What drives intrinsic value?
It's future cash
It's
flows.
basically cash flows, growth, and risk. We can use a discounted cash flow model to frame. This is why when people say, you're using a DCF model to value companies, I say, well, look, I care about cash flows, growth, and risk, don't you? You might not like my discount rate, but don't tell me that a DCF model is not, I mean, DCF is just a technique for estimating cash flows, growth, and risk. But the value of a business is the present value of its cash flow over what length of time? Over forever. Remember, in traditional valuation, you start with the time horizon that is longer than any strategist has ever thought about. You're saying, look, I care about value. So when people argue that maximizing value is short term, you know what they're arguing against, right? They're arguing against stock prices. They're saying stock price. That's a different debate to have. Our market, and the answer is not as cut and dry as most people think it is, right? Most people assume markets must be short term. The evidence is actually stronger that markets are a little too long term. What short term market? Remember, short term market care about the earnings in the here and the now. What short term market would attach the value that people attach to Peloton when it went public, or Zomato when it went public? I mean, these companies they're not even, there's not even a breath of a chance that they will make money in the near term, right? But maximizing value is the most long-term thing you can do. You can't take, do something really short-term to improve. You can't pull off a Monte-Carlo. Remember that guy? Monte-Carlo was this guy, the farmer bro, or whatever they called him. He made all these YouTube videos. For a brief moment, he sucked me into his ecosystem because in one of his YouTube videos, he claimed that he'd learned corporate finance by watching my classes. I still take multiple showers every day to try to wash that off. Because what he did was he bought these drugs that served a few thousand people. They'd been patented in production for a while. He'd buy them 8, 9, or 10 years into their patent life. And after he bought them the day after, what was his modus operandi?
Which is a jack of all trades.
He'd take the price from $500 to $50,000. And because these people needed the drug to live, this is not just, it's just plain immoral, right? And he claimed he was doing it to maximize value. What's wrong with that claim? So basically charging more, will it increase his earnings in the near term? Of course it will. You're dying, you need this drug, you're going to pay the 50,000 come whatever. But if you're building a pharmaceutical business, how is this good for your long-term value, right? I mean, who is going to come and work for you in your R&D? He was mistaking maximizing earnings next year for maximizing value. So don't get the straw man of maximizing value. That must mean you're short term. Don't let that intimidate you, because value is much more long term than any of these people pushing back against. But if you start with that end game of my objective is to maximize value, corporate finance becomes very simple. Every decision a business makes falls into one of three buckets. It can be an investment decision, a financing decision, or a dividend decision. I challenge you to find me a decision that doesn't, to me, a corporate finance decision is any decision that involves the use of money. Is there anything a business does where money doesn't get spent? Everything is corporate finance. What are investment decisions? It could be taking a project, it could be doing an acquisition, it could be deciding to add sausage to the menu for the hot dog stand outside. And I'm going to state the first principle that governs corporate finance, the investment principle. When you as a business go out and make investments, take projects, do acquisitions, the investment principle says make sure the returns you make on that investment exceed a minimum acceptable hurdle rate. Buzzword, right? Let me put some flesh on that minimum acceptable hurdle rate. That hurdle rate should reflect the riskiness of the investment you're making. Riskier investments need higher hurdle rates than safer. Everybody agree with that? And should reflect where you get your money. There are only two ways you can fund a business, debt or equity. So your hurdle rate should reflect the risk of the investment and the mix of debt and equity. So that's half of the investment principle. You're saying, what about returns? Again, I'll state the principle that governs how we think about returns in finance. First, return should be based on cash flows, not earnings. Why? Because you can't spend earnings. Try. Somebody was complaining about the Starbucks across the street and how it takes like an hour. Let's say you make it through that hour, you get to the cash register, you order a latte. What does it cost you? $6 and something now? Offer to pay with earnings. Say, look, I'm at Stern School of Business. I have this big stream of earnings coming once I get out. Will you give me the latte? Unless you have a really stupid cashier, he or she's going to look at you and say, that's all very nice, but do you have a credit card or do you have, or your Apple Pay? You can't pay with earnings. Cash in, cash out, much cleaner. Should reflect when you get the cash flows. Would you rather get cash flows earlier or later? Don't take too long. This is what happens when you go to business school. Sometimes your senses get perverted. You're 4 years old. You'd rather get this if it's the same cash flow. You'd rather get it earlier rather than later. So I'm going to factor in when you get the cash flows, and should have all side effects built into it. What does that mean? It's a lot of garnishing in investment analysis. After you've done the number crunching, people say, but there are strategic considerations. There's synergy, there's control. They want a buzzword. They don't want to put numbers on it. No, if you want to talk about synergy or strategic considerations, it's my job to bring them into your cash flows. Because if there's synergy, it has to show up in the cash flows, right? If what you mean by strategic is I can do all these other things that are lucrative, I'm going to bring them into the cash flows. The investment principle says go out and take projects that earn a return that exceeds your hurdle rate. Does it make you short term? Is there anything in what I said that I said take cash flows? I didn't say stop after year 3. I said keep going. So if you have taken you're building an airport. I know what your cash flows are going to look like. I'm a realist. What's going to be the cash flow in year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5? Big negative, big negative, big negative, big negative. Once you open the airport, I'm going to look for positive cash flows. What I'm saying is the present value of all of those cash flows, the rate of return you make across those cash flows has to be greater. I'm not asking you to make that money in year 1 or year 2, but I'm saying if you make a long-term investment, it's got to be back-ended. You got to make enough money at the back end to cover what you put in at the front end. That's the investment principle. It applies whether you look at a small project or a big project, cost cutting or revenue growth, acquisitions, big projects. The financing principle, I said there are 2 ways you can raise money for a business. You can borrow the money, let's call it debt, and you can use your own money, let's call it equity. Remember, everything I say applies to private business as well. You start a small private business, it's your money is the equity, the bank loan you took is the debt. If you ask me what's the right mix of debt and equity, I'll give you the financing principle. The financing principle says the right mix of debt and equity for you, keyword is for you, is the mix that minimizes your hurdle rate. The 2 parts that say minimizes the hurdle rate. What's the advantage of having a lower hurdle rate over a higher hurdle rate? What does it allow you to do as a business? Yeah. Take on more projects and makes every one of your existing projects more lucrative, right? If it costs you only 9% to raise money rather than 10% collectively, you've just taken on increase your capacity to take projects, you've made your existing projects more lucrative. Now, I said for you, which must mean the mix can't be the same. There is no one optimal mix, right? If you're a young startup, what's the right mix of debt and equity for you? All equity, right? Borrowing money is like putting dynamite in the company because you're putting entire value come from future growth. A startup that borrows money is playing with fire. So the right mix is 100% equity. As you mature as a company, that could change. And I'll show you my corporate life cycle. But when people say, well, what's your optimal debt ratio? I say, what does that even mean? For whom? For Coca-Cola, I'll give you an answer. For Peloton, I'll give you a very different answer. But the right mix is the mix that minimizes your hurdle rate. And if you ask me, what kind of debt should I take? You know what I'm talking about, right? You can take short-term debt or long-term debt. Dollar debt, euro debt, rupee debt. Floating rate debt, straight debt, convertible debts. Basically, there are all these choices. Saying, which one should I pick? The one thing you cannot do is call in an investment banker to tell you what to use. That's like walking in an electronics store and asking the salesman, what's the right TV for me? You know what you're going to walk out with every single time, right? The 70-inch plasma TV that costs $3,500. You live in a tiny studio apartment where the TV won't even fit in to get into your apartment. You know why you picked the 70-inch flat plasma? You think the salesman is thinking about you? Are you that naive? So you ask a salesman, which TV should I buy? He's looking around and say, which one am I going to get the biggest commission on? That's the one that's right for you. What do you think the banker is going to say? What's the right kind of debt? He's not looking at what's right for my client. He's playing the game of what are my biggest commissions going to be on? But why are you asking the banker? The right debt for you is the one that best matches your projects. We've been talking about infrastructure companies. You're building an airport in Mumbai. First, should your debt be short-term or long-term? Long-term, because it's a long-term investment. You want to lock it in. Should it be in rupees or in dollars? Rupees. And don't play the game of dollar debt is cheap, but the cash flows you're going to get from this are going to be in rupees. It should be long-term rupee debt. Then we can ask about special features you might want to put in the debt. Maybe you want to tie the interest rate to the amount of air traffic that comes into India. We can be creative, but we're trying to create debt that best matches your assets. This isn't rocket science. Find the right kind of debt basically means find the debt that best matches your assets. Then you get to the dividend principle. Here's what the dividend principle says. Remember I said there's a hurdle rate that you come up with? Let's say it's 9%. Say you look around. Project 1 makes 7%, project 2 makes 7.5%. And in fact, every project you're looking at now makes less than 9%. What should you do? Tell you one choice is take the highest return project. I can make that's the best project I can make, 8.5%. But there's always a better alternative, right? If every project you look at earns a return less than your hurdle rate, what's the logical thing to do? Just give back the cash. I've never understood why people, when they look at dividends, start with an air of, this is terrible. The company's paying dividends, and it gets even worse if it does buybacks. This is the worst thing ever. Why do farmers seed their land? What's the objective? You put seed in land. Is it because you like to see the crops grow? That's part of it, right? You like to see the crops grow. You might enjoy that moment at the peak when they're all, in their glory. But what's the end game if you're a farmer? You harvest the crops. What do you think dividends and buybacks are? They're harvesting of investments you've made. And there will be a point in time in your business life where it's time to harvest. You can't keep seeding land all the time, because what kind of farmer would you be? You wouldn't be a farmer that ever makes an income. The dividend policy principle says if you cannot find investments that make your hurdle rate, give the money back to the owners. Now, until 40 years ago, the only way you could give money back as a public, if you're a private business, you know how this worked out, right? What do? As an owner, you just extracted cash. But as a publicly traded company, it's a little more involved because returning cash to the owners is one way to do it, which was pay dividends. Until 1980, 81, around the world, the only way companies return. The problem with dividends is they're sticky. You know what that means? Once you start paying dividends, it becomes very difficult to stop. Not impossible, difficult to stop. Dividends are rigid. And in a world where economies were stable and companies had predictable earnings, dividends were fine, right? Is that the world we live in now? No, we've been hit with COVID. Dividends don't make sense anymore. We want a flexible dividend policy where your dividend is not $3 every year or grows at 3% a year. It reflects the fact that whether you're doing well or bad. What do you think buybacks are? I mean, people just don't get they think of buybacks as this strange phenomenon that came out of the skies. It's devastating businesses. Buybacks are just flexible dividends. And to see how much more flexibility there is in buybacks and dividends, go look at the first quarter of 2020 when COVID hit. Everybody knew the economy was going to slow down, right? Dividends, there was barely a dent. Why? Because people didn't want to stop paying dividends. Buybacks, all of a sudden you saw companies pull back on buyback programs saying, look, we told you we'd buy for 5 billion, but that was before we realized the global economy was going to shut down. That's a healthier place to be than being stuck with the dividend that you're paying, even though you can't afford it. That's corporate finance in one page. Everything else is icing. In fact, in my corporate finance class, this page shows up pretty much before every class because everything in the class is tied to something in the page. We spend the first couple of weeks talking about the objective right at the top. So then we move on to talking about risk and bringing into hurdle rates. So when you talk about beta, remember it's a means to an end. You don't like the CAPM, fine. But don't come to the conclusion that just because you don't like the CAPM, risk doesn't affect hurdle rates. That's an absurdly stupid place to be. 26 sessions later, we're essentially through this. We go back to tie everything you do in corporate finance to valuation. So the tail end of my corporate finance class is saying everything you do as a business shows up in your value. And that's why I said valuation is just the same class flipped backwards, right? Because valuation, you're focused on the top line. And already you can see that to do valuation well, you need to understand corporate finance. That's why most equity research analysts fail, is they don't understand the basics of running a business. When you're Kathy Wood, and you tell me that an automobile company can have 60% margins or 40% margins, you've lost your mind. You know why automobile companies can't have 40% margins? Because you got to make the damn car before you sell it. Software companies can have 40% margins. Why? The unit economics work in your favor, right? Microsoft, when it sells an extra unit of software, it costs absolutely nothing. Of course, you can have 40% margins. The greatest automobile company in the world still has to make the damn car, drive it off the assembly line, and then get it to a customer. There's zero chance that a manufacturing company can have 40% margins. Now, some of you know, I wrote about the Adani Group last week. I had zero interest in this group until the Hindenburg hit it. And then I said, you know what? Somebody's got to talk about it. And I valued the Adani Group. I gave it 7% margins. It's at 3.6% margins right now. But I stopped at 7. You know what? It's an infrastructure company. Infrastructure companies tend to be quasi-utilities. You know what I mean by quasi-utilities, right? You build an airport, you don't have unlimited pricing power. You can't go to the airline and say, we now own the gates, pay us 50 times more. It doesn't work that way because the airlines are going to the government is going to say these people need to fly to keep the economy going. They could charge you to take baggage off you're a customer, you flew into Mumbai airport, we won't release your baggage until you give it. Technically, they could do it, but that's going to create. So with infrastructure companies, the global average margin is about 5.5%. You got to live in the world you're in, and that requires bringing in some business sense. So corporate finance is a core to valuation. And you can already see why you can be a great business person without ever taking a corporate finance class, right? Do you think Dhirubhai Ambani understood? Dhirubhai Ambani, for those of you who don't know, created India's largest company, Reliance. He's a fifth grade dropout. Do you think he understood the core principles of corporate finance? Probably a lot better than the bankers who came in with risk and return models. He understood that if it costs you 11% to raise money, that it's stupid, it's destructive to take investments that make 4%. Good business people through the ages have always understood these first principles. You know who doesn't? People with MBAs and PhDs in cities like this one, in big buildings, who think they're special because they went to Harvard or Stanford, they got an MBA. The first principles don't apply to me. Through history, whenever you hear that about 5 or 10 years later, you see a blow up. The first principles matter to everybody. So with that lead in, let's talk about how this connects with intrinsic value. So I've given you my compressed corporate finance class. A couple of you are in my valuation class, you're going to get so I'm going to give you a compressed valuation class for those of you not going to be there. We mystify intrinsic value. In fact, the invention of DCF was probably the worst thing that could happen for intrinsic value because it's made value into a gigantic Excel spreadsheet, right? Cut back to the core. Here's what drives the value of a company. 6 inputs. 3 relate to your business model. First is revenue growth. What does revenue growth capture? It captures the growth part of your business model. With each one, I'm going to stop and ask you if you have a business, whether you want a high number or a low number, and I'm going to hold you accountable. So with revenue growth for your business, would you like a high number or a low number?
Stable number.
Really? You want a business with a stable number? That's not a great business. So would you prefer a stable 5 or an expected 15? Okay, but don't say you guess, because that's the entrepreneurial mindset, right? If you want a stable 5, there's nothing wrong with it, but buy a bond, right? Don't start a business because you want stable 5. So you want growth because higher growth means, so on itself, you're saying, why not go for higher growth? But then I'm going to be the skunk at the party saying, but you're the largest market share company in a mature market. You can already see that real world, it's not a number you can just pick out of the blue. I'd like 40%, I'd like 80%, because it depends on who you are and the business you're in. If you're Volkswagen in the automobile business, it is very, very unlikely that you can have more than a single-digit growth rate. And that's probably reaching. Why? The automobile business is a stagnant business in terms of number of cars sold. It's increasingly becoming an electric car business where other players seem to have a bigger profile than you. And you already have a big market share in the existing business. So revenue growth is going to be a number that you want a high number, but I'm going to push back and say, is that reasonable? So let's say we come up with a number. So revenue growth captures the growth part. You're saying, why are you focusing on revenue growth and not earnings growth? Can a mature company have high earnings growth? Yeah, you play accounting games, you push down costs. So revenue growth captures the growth part of your model. Second question I'm going to ask you is about the profitability of your model, right? Remember, ultimately the end game in business is not just growing revenues, it's you have to make money on monetizing those revenues. And the single metric that I'm going to use to capture the profitability is the operating margin. Operating margin, if you remember your accounting, is operating income divided by revenues. Operating income is midway through the income statement. I'm not focusing on net income because there again, changes in debt can affect it, leverage can affect it. I'm looking at your operating business. And there again, if I gave you a choice, you can say, I like a high margin, but remember what I just said. If you're a software company, say I can make 40% margins, I'm going to go along. If you're an infrastructure company, say I'd like to make 40%, I'd say I'd like to grow wings and fly, but I can't do that. You've got to be realistic. So margin captures the profitability of the business. And finally, to grow, you need to invest, right? So if you say, I want 50% growth, I'm going to say, that's nice, but you have to build another factory. He said, I don't like building factories. cost money. You say, then go back and revisit 50%. Now, do you see, by looking at these three together, and you've got to look at them together because you can't let managers pick and choose what they want with each one because they're going to pick the best one. I want high growth, I want high margins, I want low reinvestment. You can't have that. Those three inputs capture every business model that you can think of. I'll give you an example in the hospitality business, right? Until about 15 years ago, if you wanted to head into the hospitality business, you're a hotel company. Tell me the business characteristics of a hotel company. Essentially, it was a pretty mature business. So, so the growth was 7, 8, 9%. Margins were relatively low because operating a hotel is expensive. Is it a capital intensive business? Insanely capital intensive, right? Especially if you're a high profile hotel company and you're building hotels in Mumbai and New York and London. So if you're valuing a hotel company, you're probably going to use low revenue growth, especially for a larger hotel company, unless you're one of those niche hotels that is growing. You're going to use margins that reflect the fact that this is a business with a lot of operating expenses and a lot of reinvestment to get growth. Then along came Airbnb. To value Airbnb, tell me what you would do differently. First, you're now a company that doesn't own any properties. What do? You're an intermediary. Has anybody done what Airbnb did before Airbnb came along? Well, in a sense, booking.com was there first, right? I mean, it used to be a hotel booking service, but essentially it's an intermediary. So they took so whenever Silicon Valley claims to have invented something new, trust me, it's just taken something out there, dressed it up, given it billions of dollars again. Look, we invented a new business. But it's true, Airbnb is a different type of hospitality business. It's probably going to have higher revenue growth because it's disrupting an existing business. It's not going to last forever because once it gets larger, it's going to hit the same wall that hotel businesses have. You know why? Because there's only so much money you and I have to spend on vacations. Its margins are much likely to be higher in steady state, though they're going to be much less defensible. We'll talk about why. And then in terms of reinvestment, you can grow with almost nothing, right? And Silicon Valley fell in love with this model. It's the Uberization of the world, right? Because in a sense, that's exactly what Uber did to the taxi cab business. But you know how much money Uber's made in the last decade? None. It's actually lost money. So what's going wrong here with this business model, which looks so great on paper? What part of this model is failing? What did I say about the margins? They're higher, but they're less defensible. The problem with these models is when the old hotel business, you know what made it defensible, right? To start a new hotel business, you actually had to buy land, build hotels, which meant that you had to spend 5, 6, 7 years and billions of dollars getting there. Capital intensity kept competition up. You created a new business where it's easy to climb. Guess what? Not just for you, but for other people coming after you. Disruptors with this form will succeed, but there will be disruption coming. So as you look at Google and you say, oh my God, those poor people, ChatGPT is coming for them. They did it to Yahoo. Bing might do it to them, and somebody else will do it to Bing. This is the place where I disagree with Scott Galloway. Feels that the way to get these big tech companies, the only way to stop them is regulation. You got to break them up. You know what? Technology will eat its own. Facebook was riding on top of the world 5 years ago, right? Think of where it is today. So when you think about business models, those are the numbers that drive your business model. And in the denominator, you have two big inputs. One is the risk in your operating business, which you capture with the cost of capital. Again, don't let models become the enemy of common sense. You might use CAPM, beta, risk-free rates. Ultimately, what's your end game? To come up with a discount rate that reflects the operating risk of the business. You discount the cash flows back at that discount rate, you come up with a value for your business as a going concern. You see what the missing piece here is? What you haven't captured is the chance your company might not make it. If you're valuing a young startup, what percentage of young startups don't make it to year 2? but 2/3 of young startups don't make it to year 2. My DCF model reflects a 1/3 of the time you make it. I have a gigantic hole to fill, which is I've got to say what happens the remaining 2/3 of the time. The young tech startup, what happens the remaining 2/3 of the time to your money? It's not, right? Remember in statistics of decision trees, DCFs are going concern valuations. I've seen people try to pump up discount rates to capture failure risk, but you can't. It's the wrong type of risk. So I capture that with a failure risk. So if you look at all of my spreadsheets that I use to value companies, whether it's Adani Group or Tesla, very different companies. There's revenue growth, margins, reinvest, it's basically the reinvestment. And then there's a cost of capital and a failure risk. And people say, well, it seems like you're doing the same thing over and over again. Of course, I can't reinvent the drivers of value just because you have a different kind of business, but I've got to think about what's reasonable for each of these inputs for every single business. So if you were to summarize what corporate finance tells us, that big picture, the first is it's common sense. Nothing I said should come as a surprise to you, even if you've not taken a corporate finance class. Second, it's focus, right? Where does the focus come from? The fact that you're one shareholder group and you're focused on maximizing shareholder value. That's good. Having focus means that we can look at it. That's why I was able to say, this is a good investment decision, this is a bad one. This is a good financing decision, this is a bad one. But that focus does come at a cost, right? Which is if you disagree with what I'm focused on, nothing I say really makes sense. So when people disagree with, should the company be buying back? So they're not disagreeing with what the company is doing. They're disagreeing with the end game for a company. And that's why I start every one of my corporate finance classes with the end game. Because if you disagree on the end game, you're going to disagree on every single aspect. You're not going to agree that net present value should be your metric for picking projects. You're not going to agree that cost of capital, that the right debt mix is the one that minimizes cost of capital. So that focus does come at a cost. And if you look at all those alternatives I suggested, they're attacking the focus. They're not attacking what you do in corporate finance. They're saying, is that the right end game? And it's universal. It's unfortunate we call it corporate finance, in fact, because the word corporate suggests that we're devising these rules for publicly traded companies, right? But it's really universal. Every business has to make investment financing and dividend decisions. And you know what? The costs of being wrong are far worse if you have a small private business than if you have a large publicly traded company. Again, going back to that hot dog stand vendor outside, if he screws up and adds too many items to his food list, he could go under. He's not too big to fail. So if you think corporate finance is just for big companies, you're missing the point. This is something that every company. And those first principles, much you'll hear bankers say, but not this company, not at this time. And my reaction is, first principles apply no matter who you are and where you are in this process. So let's talk about the pushback. As I said, this is the focus. So the pushback you get against traditional corporate finance, and having taught it, I'm not being defensive, I understand the pushback. In fact, I probably understand the pushback argument better than some of the people making the argument. So I can make the argument for them better than they can. I'm not going to try to help them out, but I'll give you the pieces of their argument. So one is that by focusing, their argument is not against shareholder value, but against the use of stock prices. That focusing on stock prices is short-term because markets are short-term. And that's a reasonable belief. You can see where it comes from. You see prices moving up and down, and you're saying, how can the Adani Group be worth 4,000 rupees at the start of the year, and 2 months later it's worth 1,500 rupees or 1,800 rupees? The second is a group that believes that focusing on shareholders is unfair because you have all these other stakeholder groups. We talked about it. It sounds like a fair thing to do. And the third is that this is just plain wrong, that businesses should not be focused on making money and increasing value, that they're part of society, that there should be a goodness imperative that drives decisions. So let's start with sustainability, that word that I see floating around, probably invented by a Harvard Business School professor, because Harvard Business School exists for one reason and one reason alone: to invent buzzwords and concepts that consultants can make tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. It's a place where you get absolutely stupid ideas kind of bubbling up to the surface, have glorious names attached to them, and sustainability is one of those words. I think it was the 2002, 2003 Harvard Business Review. You couldn't pay me enough money to print. I mean, they would have to, I don't even know how much money they'd have to pay me to print in the Harvard Business Review, because it's brain cell killing, just reading the pieces. So let's talk about sustainability. So as I said, I'm not sure what it means. I can understand planet sustainability, right? We want to live in a planet that outlasts us. That's a different thing. We're talking about how do we make the planet. We're talking about, but in the context of business, you're talking about corporate sustainability. So what does that mean? So I'll give you a framework that I think of for companies, because it'll give us at least a way of thinking about what sustainability people are trying to do. I put companies into a corporate life cycle. This is a structure that, Shara sees in my valuation class. I use it in my corporate finance class. For me, it's the fundamental structure. I just finished a book, actually, it should come out in the next 2 months, on the corporate life cycle. And my argument is a simple one. Companies or businesses are like people. A startup is like a baby, needs constant care, attention, and capital. A very young company is like a toddler, falls, gets up, sometimes falls and doesn't get up. Remember, the mortality rate for corporate babies is much greater than for humans. You make it through the toddler years, you become a teenager. You were teenagers not that long ago, but remember what those years looked like? Every day you got up, you looked in the mirror and you said, I have lots of potential. What can I do today to screw it all up? Don't be too hard on yourself. That's the nature of being a teenager. You have a time horizon of a gnat, right? 2 minutes from now, that sounds like fun. You don't even think about what the 2 minutes. This is why you can get admitted to Harvard and make a stupid 3-minute YouTube video that leads your offer to get retracted because you said something really stupid. Businesses go through a teenage phase. And they're frustrating to work with or invest in. When I invested in Tesla in 2019, I described it as my corporate teenager. You can see why, right? Every day, one man at Tesla gets up, he looks in the mirror and says, I have lots of potential. What can I do today to screw it all up? Maybe I will tweet out about Thai divers. What is wrong with you? Maybe I'll buy $1 billion in Bitcoin. Why? You're $1 trillion company with unlimited potential and all. And I said, that's my corporate teenager. And here's what I'm doing. I'm buying it with open eyes. I know that this company will do incredibly good things, but I also know that every week there'll be something that comes along where you say, that's such a distraction. Why is he doing this? And you got to take the package, right? So for those Tesla shareholders who are frustrated by what Elon Musk is doing on Twitter, this is the package. You can't take the good stuff and take out the bad stuff. It's tied together. And after your teenage years, you're at the peak of your life. I'll tell you what it feels like, because it's in the past for me, but it might be the current for you. It's when you can go to bed at 3 o'clock, wake up at 6 o'clock, and be a fully functioning human being. Enjoy the moment while it lasts, because it's not going to last that long. At the peak of their lives, everything companies touch turns to gold. 5 years ago, not that long ago, what people thought about Google and Facebook. They could do no wrong, right? Mark Zuckerberg, genius, before the privacy scandals hit. Because after the peak of your life comes the dreaded middle age. Any of you looking forward to being middle-aged? I don't think so. But guess what? It's coming for you. When you get middle-aged, you realize life has constraints, right? You can't do the things you used to. Some are physical, some are financial. Enjoy middle age though, because after middle age, there's worse stuff coming down the pike. There's old age. And then there comes dementia, decline, and death. Sounds morbid, but companies go through this. So where would you put Tesla now? Probably still corporate teenager, but it's approaching that point where you can't be, you can't be a 28-year-old teenager and expect to get away with it too long. So you're starting to fray the limits of what you can pull off. Google and Facebook have gone from being at the peak of their lives more towards middle age. You see them laying off people, talking about constraints and limitations. Kraft Heinz and Coca-Cola, where would you put them? They're definitely not at the peak of their lives. That was 50 years ago. Middle age is probably being too kind to them because, I mean, what do they do? Well, Coca-Cola produces the sugar-laden beverage that probably creates more diabetes than any other single item on the face of the earth. And in a sense, the health clock is running against you. And what does Kraft Heinz do? Oh, create a cheese that says liquid for the rest of eternity. Okay, you know, the customer thinks Kraft Heinz cheese is good. It's probably 65 years old and continuing to age. These businesses are old companies. What about Bed Bath and Beyond? It's really a zombie. It's dead. It's like a walking dead company. Said, please put yourself out of your misery and put the rest of us out. Companies go through a life cycle. And that life cycle is going to depend on a lot of different things, right? Because if you think about how long it lasts, it depends on the sector. It took Ford almost 50 years to go from being a young company to a mature company. Why? Because he developed assembly plants. And once they got there in the late 40s, the glory days lasted a long time. For almost 35 or 40 years, they dominated the automobile business. Then they went into decline. It's been a long-term decline. And now they're trying to reinvent themselves. We'll come back and see if they can become an electric car company, but it took almost on. Same thing with GE. Born 1890, probably dead by 2021, but it stays alive because of different, but you can see it's the end game here. There's no, it's like a horror story. You know the end is coming, and the question is how gory will it be? But it took 120, 130 years for the typical 20th century company. Why? Because that's the nature of those companies. In contrast, think of a company like Yahoo, born 1992. By 1999, $100 billion company. So it did in 7 years what took Ford, 50 years to do. This is amazing, right? But here's the flip side. The glory days of Yahoo lasted about 4 or 5 years. In fact, you can date the fall of Yahoo to the date Google showed up, and then they went into decline. It wasn't a gradual decline. It was just a precipitous drop-off. Yahoo as a company basically died in 2015. I know the name hangs around and I saw a news story about them. But this again, at this point, you're taking a cadaver and you're making it look like it's walking. But about 25 years. You see where I'm going, right? The typical 21st century company has a compressed life cycle. In fact, when I wrote about this, I said tech companies age in dog years. A 25-year tech company is already looking like a 150-year-old manufacturing company. It's not good, it's not bad. It is what it is. And you know how much you learn in business school is designed for the 20th century company. Almost everything you learn in business school is for the 20th century company, right? Starting with the way we do valuation. What do we do when we get to year 10? Or year 5 in a discounted cash flow valuation? We stop and we assume cash flows continue for how long? Forever. You know why we get away with it? If you have a 100-year life or an 80-year life, forever gives you pretty much the same value. But if you have a 25-year life, it doesn't give you the same value. Maybe the way we think about terminal value in a discounted cash flow valuation has to be reframed. And it's this context that you need to think about what the emphasis in corporate finance is going to be. You're a young startup or a young company. Think of where your focus is going to be. Remember, the investment principle of financing, it's all about investments, right? You got to create the assets to create value. I would never want to be the CFO of a young startup because I'll be about at the same level as the janitor in terms of what I'm doing in the company. Nobody's going to come and talk to me, so what's the right financing mix for us? Because I mean, they're going to go raise the equity from VCs. I'm probably tagging along as a carry-on because the VC is not turning to show me your projected cash flows. He's asking the founder, what are your plans? What's the market here? As companies mature, the focus turns to financing. And it's for a practical reason. When you're a young startup, your projects make 40, 50%. Who cares whether your cost of capital is 15% or 13%? But as you mature, guess what happens to your returns? They start drifting down, you're scaling up. The returns go from 50 to 25 to 23 to 21. And all of a sudden you start looking at the other numbers saying, maybe I get more leeway by making the 15%, 13%. Mature companies, the CFO, the finance group often is the core of the company. Then you go into decline. I hope you're not thinking about investing. Your business is gone. I hope nobody at Bed Bath & Beyond is asking, where should we open our next store? I'll have an easy answer. Don't. Think about it. In fact, get rid of the project guys you have. See, what about financing? Financing for what? At this stage, what's your first job is to figure out how you kind of go away without creating too much pain. I know it doesn't sound noble, but you're essentially liquidating yourself. That's what GE is doing right now, right? They're breaking up, they're liquidating. It took them a long time to come to that point, but basically you can see the emphasis changes. And as you go through the life cycle, when I'm valuing a company, my focus also changes. I'm a young startup. I can't do a numbers-driven valuation. What a numbers-driven valuation is, I take the last 10 years, I project out the future. This is classic investment banking modeling, right? Financial modeling is all about numbers. I won't even call it valuation, just a financial model. Try that for a young startup and you're going to crash and burn. This is why bankers often claim you cannot value young startups, is because you cannot value them with their existing three accounting statement, 20-year forecast built off the past. But you can value young startups, but the value is going to depend on the story that drives the valuation. You know what I mean by a story? To value Zomato, you got to come up with what is Zomato doing, what's the potential market, what can it pull off. The fact that you don't have past numbers doesn't mean you can skip that process. But early in the life cycle, it's narrative that drives value. And you need to be able to tell a business story that actually makes sense. Not a fairy tale, but a business story that makes sense. And early on, there are no checks, right? Because I have no numbers to check it. But as the numbers start coming in, what do? I check your story and say, you told me you'd have high growth. Doesn't look like you have high growth. You told me you'd have high margins. So as the numbers start to come in, the numbers start to put a crimp on your story. And at some point, I might say, look, you keep telling me these stories, but the numbers tell me a different story. I'm going to shift my focus away from narrative to numbers. No, I don't know whether does training the street still come through Stern and teach you how to do financial modeling. They teach you how to be an Excel ninja. But there's somebody who comes through and say, we'll teach you how to, but they want you to make you banking slaves, where you go in and you will be an Excel ninja. Now, to truly do valuation, you got to step back from the frame and think about what is it I'm trying to do. I can't just project out numbers. And as all of this changes, your perfect CEO is going to shift as well, right? If you're a young startup, who do you want running your company? It's all about story. You want somebody who's a storyteller, right? A storyteller to convince VCs to invest in the company, a storyteller to convince employees to work at the company. You need a visionary. Let's call that CEO Steve the visionary. As you get to young growth, you're now starting to build a business, right? You know what happens with businesses that are run by pure visionaries? They're purists. They want their vision. They never get off the ground, right? No product or service is ever going to be true enough to the vision. So you got to be a pragmatist, where you say, okay, I'll accept this. I want this vision, but I'll accept constraints. The right CEO has to be Paula the pragmatist. You keep going and you get to high growth. You're now building a business. You have to build capacity. You have to worry about supply chains. You got to Bob the builder, somebody who can build a business. Notice how I'm being non-sexist. My CEOs are going male, female, female. So now this is the kind of surface level non-sexism it's easy to do. So I'll kind of go along with it. Then you get to mature growth. You're now basically not looking for 30% growth. You're looking for opportunistic growth. Maybe there's a market. Maybe there's a new product I can introduce that adds to the growth rate. Then you're finally a mature company. You know what you're doing? You're playing defense. Everybody's coming after you. You got to figure out how to keep your existing businesses generating cash flows. You can't take your eye off the ball and keep thinking about new businesses because people are going to eat your lunch and take away your cash cow. That's called Dawn of the Defender. And finally, you enter into decline. You know who you want running your company? Larry the Liquidator. When you get a chance, get on Google search, type in Larry the Liquidator. Character in a movie called Other People's Money from about 30 years ago. You know who plays Larry the Liquidator? Danny DeVito. Kind of gives you a vision of what people think about CEOs of declining companies, right? Or crude, short, and no, he was actually the protagonist in the movie is Gregory Peck, the CEO of a company, refuses to deal with decline. He makes phone cables, and everybody switched to fiber optic, but he keeps making phone cables. Here again, you got to push back against the conventional wisdom, which is there is a perfect CEO out there. These are the characteristics. I've read at least 50 pieces, again, coming out of the Harvard Business Review or McKinsey Quarterly, and you can see why they have a vested interest in pushing this idea that there's a perfect CEO. These are the 12 characteristics that make for a perfect CEO, and it's complete bunk. Because how can there be one perfect CEO for every company, right? The perfect CEO for a mature company will not be the perfect CEO for a young startup. To me, the life cycle kind of, when I look at a company, brings me back to reality because it says this is what they should be focused on. This is what drives value. But as you age as a company, just like as human beings, what do you keep wishing? I wish I could be young again. In fact, for human beings, there's an entire ecosystem that's built around telling you you can be young again. Composed of plastic surgeons, physical trainers who can help you. You can be 25 again. And does anybody ever get young again? What happens the more they visit the plastic? At some point, they all start to look like Joan Rivers in their 70s, right? Her face doesn't move anymore. But the hope springs eternal. And in the business setting, you know who's in the ecosystem telling you can be young again? Consultants and bankers. You can be still a big acquisition. You'll be young again. So when you think about this dream of reincarnation, it's human nature. You want to be young again. CEOs constantly say, what can I do to rediscover my youth? And you know what makes the sales pitch for consultants and bankers so lucrative is they point to other companies that have pulled this off. Can you think of companies that were on the verge of decline that found this magical way to go back to growth? They're legendary by this point in time. Any companies that come to mind?
Was it like Fujifilm where they weren't selling as much film and they changed like?
Yeah, but that's still like a minor facelift. It really wasn't big enough. I'm talking about massive rebirth. You guys know what Apple looked like in the late 90s as a company? What did it do? It made basically personal computers that fewer and fewer people were buying. I mean, by the late 90s, it looked like Apple was on a pathway to just going away. And what did reincarnation, what form? First, who is the messenger of reincarnation there? But remember, Steve Jobs was also the architect of Apple's decline because in his previous iteration as CEO, he did some really visionary, stupid things. Remember, the two words are not mutually exclusive. Like what? I mean, I've owned an Apple computer going back in time to the very first Mac. And I actually bought the Lisa. Lisa was one of the computers, if you get a chance, read it. One worst designed computers of all time in terms of there's no expansion capacity. It came with these things that were rigidly already said. Why? Because Steve Jobs thought that this was the way a computer should be. Came back. And it was a new Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs, I call them Steve Jobs 1 and Steve Jobs 2. And what did he do at Apple that kind of said? Where the entire world has kind of shifted because he started the iPod, kind of disrupted the music business. But the iPod was just the opening for the iPhone. You know what businesses the iPhone has disrupted? Pretty much every other business. Everybody who's gone public in the last 10 years, who's a social media company or a delivery. You think DoorDash could exist if we didn't have smartphones? You think Facebook would be as big as it is if we couldn't post on smartphones? Clearly, he got a reincarnation. He made a $4 billion company into $400 billion. Here's another example. 2013, Microsoft. Where did it get almost all of its money, cash flows, and earnings? That time it got it from two cash cows.
Windows?
Office and Windows, right? It was like one of those two at wonders. I was reading about this group that sang the Macarena song. Also, you've seen it at parties when people get too drunk, they do the Macarena. You know how many hits that group had? One, Macarena. Nobody ever heard from them again. Microsoft was like a Macarena of corporations. Office and Windows, great songs, we can sing at a party, but that's it. That was the company that Satya Nadella came in as CEO. And what form did reincarnation take there? Cloud business. The subscription model for Office. And 10 years later, Microsoft is back to being at the top of the game. So you go to company, you could be the next Apple, you can be the next Microsoft. You can see how alluring it is for people. Okay. And that's where I think the sustainability siren song comes in. We can make you the next Apple and Microsoft, as if you can bottle what they did and just repackage it and sell it. If you look at the sales pitch for sustainability, one part is pretty sensible. It says, look, you want to do things that keep your business more intact. Remember the mature phase, that you stretch it up, that you don't do things that put it at risk, like taking short-term actions that harm your, what? Milton Friedman would have agreed with that statement. It's completely compared. Nothing in corporate finance that I said, so do unsustainable things to increase earnings next year. This is the problem when you set up strawmen, as you say, companies focus on earnings and stock prices. We're going to tell them how to be more long-term. So if that is the case, I'm okay with it, but sustainability experts are the last people who will be able to tell me what the consequences of because to do that, you really need to understand the insides of your business, right? What makes a customer buy a car? What will make them stop buying the car? But if the end game in sustainability of the sustainability is not to make companies do the right thing to increase value, but to make them last longer, then we're in deep trouble. And I have a feeling somewhere in this debate, that's become the end game. We're going to make companies last longer. Do you really want Bed Bath & Beyond to last longer? What's wrong with you? A corporation is a legal entity. The purpose of your existence is gone. Please leave. You want the East India Company still around as a publicly traded company? How many countries can you take over and make an entire division of your company? You can't do that anymore. And thank God for that. But when I hear corporate sustainability experts talk about you need to do this to make your company last longer, I'm reminded of the Egyptian pharaohs who had a little bit of the same objective, right? They wanted to live forever. So what did they do? After they died, they got these people to wrap them in bandages, stick them in a crypt with all their favorite things around them, expecting to come to life and drink out of that favorite cup and watch their favorite TV show. There were no TV shows, but basically. But you know what actually happened, right? They stayed dead. And 2,000 years later, British explorers showed up, got into the crypt, stole all their favorite stuff. Mission accomplished. It's an absurd objective to tell me that you want to make a company last longer. So about last year, I was asked to give a talk to 50 CSOs. You heard what a CSO is? It's amazing how the corporate hierarchy keeps getting, just like we have more deans for, we have deans for like 15 different things. I don't even know what they're deans for anymore. CSO. So CSO is a Chief Sustainability Officer. First, you got to be a pretty big company to afford a CSO. So there are 50 CSOs, many of the largest companies in the US, they came together. And for whatever reason, they asked me to talk to them. I don't know, people just like being abused, I guess. So I asked them, what do you guys do? What does a CSO do? I know what a CFO does. I kind of know what a CEO does. I even know what a CIO does. But what the heck does a CSO do? And they were incredibly confused. These are 50 CSOs, they weren't sure. And I'll classify the response I got into 3 groups. The first is what I call the Dalai Lama group, which is, they said, we're the long-term thinkers. I said, that's very interesting. So what makes you more long-term than the rest of us? Did you go to the school of enlightenment? This must be a skill set, right? You spend 5 years in the Himalayas staring at a rock and maybe you become long-term. But the very notion that you think this shows you how arrogant it is, right? That somehow you know what 10 years from now is going to look like, and now you're going to tell companies how to get there. So about 10 of the 50 thought they were Dalai Lamas. I said, okay, I don't want to hang out around you guys, but go back and deliver your enlightenment. The second group reminded me of Jiminy Cricket in the Pinocchio movies. Remember Jiminy Cricket? He sits on Pinocchio's shoulder and he acts as a conscience. And what does Pinocchio do? He ignores him and does whatever he wants until he gets into really bad trouble. He says, I should have listened to you. So Jiminy Cricket CSO basically tries to be the corporate conscience. I can live with this. So you're sitting on that project meeting where they're talking about doing this big acquisition of a company that has terrible reputational risk, and you act as a conscience saying, guys, this is not the right thing to do. Most of the time, what do? They do what Pinocchio did, ignore you anyway. But at least there's somebody speaking up as a corporate conscience. And the third group are, of course, the money makers. They said our objective is to make the company last long. Next time you're in a sustainability class, I want you to first get that word nailed down. There are healthy definitions I can live with, and some very unhealthy versions. Any questions on sustainability? Yes.
So isn't basically the enlightened ones just looking for nothing in the future, basically?
That's fine, but how do you, so here's my question. What makes you better at telling me what the future will look like? So when you say value for the future, I understand, right? You want to do it, but to deliver value for the future, you really need to understand the business better than the existing people. Remember, you're a CSO. You know what the pathway you got to be CSO was, right? You didn't work through the ranks. You probably jumped from, one enlightened job to another enlightened job. You collected a bunch of enlightenment in the way. You go to every expert meeting. Maybe you go to Davos every year. You don't have the qualifications to connect businesses to the long term. And second, when people, every time you get an expert group predicting what the world will look like 10 years from now, how on track have they been? I might as well look at, go to a suit set and look at my hand, tell me what the world will look like 10. They're horrifically bad, right? Because expert groups are, there's actually a great book on who the best forecasters are. If you get a chance, read it. It's called The Fox and Something. And basically, this is a book that looks at forecast by experts, enlightened ones, versus forecast by people who don't know very much, but they know a lot of different things. And you know what this book finds? That forecast by people who have this wide range of interest is actually better than these people who claim that they can forecast the future. I'll be quite honest, I don't trust future forecasters because we've seen how bad they've been over the last 50 years, in fact, through time. So I understand what you're saying. I want to do. But we say value for the long term, it means absolutely nothing. If that person is sitting in on an investment decision process, tell me what productive things he can bring to the table that actually make that decision a better long-term decision. I can't think of a single thing. Because if he pulls out what the Paris or the Glasgow group said, this is what climate change is going to look like 10 years from now, guess what? That's adding nothing productive to the conversation. So the enlightened ones to me scare me the most because they're arrogant and sanctimonious people who have no business actually being in a decision process, but think they know more than they do. Which brings me to stakeholder wealth maximization. It's a fairness argument, right? You're saying, this is so unfair. Why do you pick, you're playing favorites here, picking shareholders. And there seems to be an easy fix. Instead of focusing on shareholder wealth, why don't we maximize stakeholder wealth? Admit it, you're tempted, right? Sounds like it's bigger, fairer. And in many ways, it'll make your life a lot simpler as a CEO if you claim to be stakeholder wealth maximized, because you come across to society as somebody who cares about all these different stakeholders. And about 4 years ago, the Business Roundtable, which is composed of CEOs of some of America's largest companies, got together. So Jamie Dimon on it, Jeff Bezos on it. And they put out this statement. I don't think any of these CEOs actually wrote the statement. I hope they didn't, because this is perhaps the stupidest thing I've ever seen come out of a group of people claiming to be CEOs of companies. And here's what the Business Roundtable conference said. It said, the fundamental commitment of business is to keep everybody happy. This is what happens when you let people who want to say nothing say it in profound ways. You can say absolutely nothing. We want to deliver value for shareholders. I didn't know about this in 2019. That's really what you want to do, is deliver value for shareholders. Invest in our employees. That's why do you invest in your employees? Because you want them to stay on, you want them to work, you want them to create. But basically, this is a statement that basically says our job is to keep everybody happy. And stakeholder wealth maximization people in the schools were delighted. They said, finally, companies are singing our siren song. They're saying everybody matters. I want to play along. Let's assume you decide that you're going to maximize stakeholder wealth. Sounds like shareholder wealth is a terrible thing, because what's the implicit message here? To maximize shareholder wealth, you must be ripping off every other stakeholder. Implicit in the pushback against shareholder wealth is, if you maximize shareholder wealth, it must mean you don't care about your employees. Ask people a very simple question. If I gave you a list of the 10 companies that have seen their market value increase the most over the last 10 years, and the 10 companies, the market values have decreased the most over the last 10 years, or within any sector, taken the top half of the sector, companies who've seen their stock prices go up in the bottom half, and asked you, which of these groups would you rather be working at? I know what my answer is going to be. I want to work at Costco, not at Bed Bath & Beyond. Most of the time, companies that are doing well are able to take care of their employees better, right? Bed Bath & Beyond can't be offering better health plans right now. There is no way they can do it. Second thing you will hear is, well, if you maximize stock prices, it must mean you don't care about your customers. This is so stupid, I don't even know where to begin. You think Amazon maximize stock price by not caring about its employee? You know why I buy on Amazon Prime, right? I get my stuff when they claim it'll come. And if I don't like it, I go drop it in the box. And you know why they want satisfied customers? Because I know anytime I have to pick an item and it's available on Prime and somewhere else, I'll pay the extra amount to get it on Prime. So most of the time, again, are there companies that take advantage of customers to increase earnings in the near term? Yeah, you could pull a Martin Shkreli. But you can't use the exception to make it the rule. And finally, the argument is, if you maximize stock prices, it must mean you don't care about society. If you care about society, you're going to do good for society, right? 4 years ago, Amazon created a $500 million charitable fund. And the fund would do good, right? It would send money to needy charities. Why were they able to do it? $500 million is a lot of money, right? Why were Amazon shareholders okay with it? Because in that year, 2020, Amazon's market cap increased by $300 billion. Your shareholders, your market cap goes up by 300 billion. Say, look, can I give away $500 million? You're feeling flush. No, go give away $500 million. Make it $1 billion. How about $2 billion? This year, Amazon's announced that it's pulling back from that $500 million. Not because it's in trouble, but because its market cap is down 40–50% since its peak a year ago. It's starting to struggle a little bit more with its profits. Companies that are doing well are in a much better position to do stuff for society. So this notion that maximizing shareholder wealth has to come at the expense of other stakeholders is a nice story that's told over and over again in classes about stakeholder wealth. And this is why they invented case studies, right? It's a stupid way to learn business. It's a stupid way to learn business. Why? Because you think the people who wrote the case studies don't have the answer already. They make it sound like we're going to give you a case study. It's objective. You make your own decisions. Believe me, that's absolute nonsense. Every case study has a scripted answer. In fact, Harvard Business School case studies, instructors are given the scripted answers. This is when the question will come in. And they're so good at this, they can predict what the question will come from. And this is the answer you should give because it'll lead to the next question. The truth is that if you go the route of maximizing stakeholder wealth, you have what I call confused corporatism. You have no idea what you're trying to do at any point in time because it keeps shifting on you. And it gives you complete immunity from being questioned. In a strange way, you're accountable to everyone. You're accountable to no one. You see what? You're CEO of a company. You claim that your job is stakeholder wealth maximization. The stock price is down 20%. You go in front of your shareholders, and what do you tell them? Guys, I do care about society. I do the right thing. Then you go in front of your bondholders who lost 15% of money. You say, guys, you know, the stockholders are putting a lot of pressure on me, and employees are underpaid. So I had to make sure they got a better pay. You go to the employees and they're saying, look, you're laying off a lot of people, our healthcare. So you know what, this year we had these issues. Customers are demanding lower prices, so we can't give you the pay. Every group use the other group as a fault. It's amazing for you as a CEO because you're accountable to no one. In confused corporatism, I tell people to put themselves around a decision table. You're a retail company thinking about whether to open a store. Tell me how you're going to make a decision. If your objective is, I have to think about shareholders, I've got to think about both. I will wager by the time you go around the table, you will get decision paralysis because there will be you're never going to get it. I mean, the nature of these groups is they have conflicting interests, right? And if you're tempted by confused corporatism, I'm going to give you two cases where I've seen confused corporatism based stakeholder wealth. And you tell me whether you want this to be the end game for every company. The first is the old-time government-owned companies. I grew up in an economy where government-owned companies were the rule, not the exception. And I felt sorry for the CEOs of these companies. Because here's what they were told. Your job is to make steel. Oh, by the way, while you're making steel, build the plants in these three states because that's where the next elections might be held. And while you're building the plants, make sure that these people get the contracts because they have connections with us. And while you do all of that, make sure the employees get paid well because they might go on strike and that's not good for us. And while you're doing all of this, make sure you make some money for us on the side. You can already see, you're saying, what am I supposed to do here? So you know what they did? Often nothing. Sometimes the best thing to do is, I won't take a project at all. Who wants this paid? That's one end game. Basically, if you don't know what your end game is, you're going to do things that reflect that confusion. Here's another end game. And it's in the institution I work for. Work at a research university. If you're an outsider looking at a university and ask you what should the end game be, what's the end game for a university, at least when you think about universities? What's a university? From the very, what is it? Education, right? And we're a tuition-driven university. We're not Harvard or Yale where you have a $60 billion endowment. So if this were run with its core constituency in mind, and you think about a pyramid, who should be on top of the university pyramid? Who should be given first priority? Without undergraduate, the school dies, right? You guys feel like you've been put on top of this list? Let's get real. In a research university, you know who occupies the very top round? It's tenured faculty. The lunatics run the asylum. So they say, this is what I want. I would teach 3 classes a year. That's about 4.5 hours a week. You can never fire me unless I do something truly immoral or lunatic or the version of lunacy. What other job has these kinds of, I'll set the times I work, you can never fire me, but we set the rules. Then below the tenured faculty will be the faculty on tenure track who are moving towards tenure. And then you'll have PhD students and graduate students who are doing research. And then you keep moving and moving and moving and moving and moving and moving. And you get to the very bottom of the pyramid. Guess who inhabits it? You guys. Have you ever wondered why universities are not more responsive to your needs? You're at the bottom of the damn pyramid. You expect the pyramid to adjust to your needs? But you sit in a university meeting. And I do this with every committee I'm part of. It makes me unpopular. So what's the end game? What are we trying to do? Now, I was in a committee on teaching evaluations, that thing, and we went through I've been in 3 committees on that damn thing. Should we have 9 questions or 7 questions? Should we have a scale of 7 or a scale of 5? This is what committees waste their time on. I said, what's the end game? He said, what do you mean, what's the end game? I said, what are the evaluations designed to do? Are we trying to make teaching better for the undergraduates? Is that the end game here? Because then the kinds of questions we're going to ask are going to be very different. They said, we're not sure. I think the departments wanted for tenure decisions. I said, so we're designing evaluations so departments can make decisions on tenure, very different. And then about halfway through the committee meeting, somebody would come and say, no, the objective here is informational. So students will know who to take. If you don't know where you're going, it doesn't matter how you get there, right? If you can't even define your end game, guess what you're going to do? You're going to be like, like one of those mice that runs from one attraction to another. Basically, you really can't stay focused. Do you really want every company to be like a research university? Incredibly inefficient? Because that's what's going to come from not having a focus. You are going to be inefficient because each decision is going to be driven by a different interest group in mind. You're doing that to keep that interest group happy. How the heck are you going to get an end game that is actually healthy? It took us a long time to get there. Let's get to the last of the 3, the Theocratic Trifecta. The ESG bandwagon. This bandwagon accumulated a lot of people in the last decade. I've never seen a concept take off that as quickly as ESG has and get as much of the establishment on its side, which should make you suspicious. When you have disruption where the establishment kicks in, it's really probably not disruption. That's why the establishment is kicking in, right? But this was on the 50th anniversary of Milton Friedman's piece of 2019. I'd seen ESG take off, establishment got in, COVID was, COVID was still, I think, just starting to kick in. And people were talking about how good companies were doing so much better. And I was curious. I started my ESG discussion because I was curious. What is this concept? What is it taking off? And as I looked at it, I realized that at the base of the concept is something that it's like quicksand. You're building upon a foundation that is almost impossible to harm. Let me explain. If I went around this room and asked each of you to describe what a good person is. I know people, ESG services now claim they're not measuring goodness. It's amazing they keep changing what they claim to measure. But the original idea is we're going to measure goodness, something you have for society. I'll wager I'll get 9 different answers. You know what? Because it reflects where you were born, what culture you have, remember, if you're a religious person, already a big part of what good is already defined by that, right? So you see me eating a beef burger and you're a religious Hindu, I'm already on the bad side of the divide. So goodness is person specific. It's not that it's subjective, but it's person specific. And already we're a dangerous ground because what do Sustainalytics and Refinitiv claim to do? They claim to have come up with a number for companies that somehow keeps all of us on board. How the heck do you even do that? So it's not just it's fuzzy and personal. It's a number that you never get convergence on, because you're trying to take what is an individual decision and making it into a collective decision. But they're still doing it, right? Both they have ESG scores for thousands of companies. So you're saying what goes into it? So I'm going to run a little test on you. And I don't want you to think about ESG scores. I want you to rank, just give me the best on ESG and worst on ESG. 7 companies, all high profile companies not just heard of, that you have a view on. If you were asked to rank best on ESG and worst on ESG, which of these 7 companies would you make worst on ESG? Let's start with that. Anybody want to try? Sumantra, what's your worst company on this list? Go with your gut, because worst, of course, reflects your virtues, your value system. So,
I think ExxonMobil.
and so by doing that, you've already given me a sense of what you value here, which is climate change, and fossil fuel companies are bad for climate change. Anybody want to disagree and put a different company as worst company? Altria, and what is it about Altria? Tobacco. So basically you're saying health is my driving force. Anybody else?
Are you asking my moral objection? Or
Whatever, pick your person. So again, as I said, there's no right or wrong here. It reflects your value system. So if you were to rank based on your value system, best to worst, what's the worst company? Facebook, because your privacy and you see already that, you know, you go around. It's not that, you know, Sumantra is right and it's just the reality that you bring in different value systems. And if you think about best companies, again, you can see that your value system comes into play. So I went to the different services. I picked, I think, ISG, MSCI, and S&P, and I looked at the scores, and they're all over the place. You see companies show up as high in one, low in others. In fact, studies consistently show that this reflects different value systems. In fact, if we're looking at Sustainalytics, I'd love to know the team that works on these scores. And I'd love to know how, where they went to school, how old they are, where they grew up, because that's going to tell me a lot about what they think of as good or bad. And that's not a great place for a score to come in. Nobody, when I look at a bond rating, I don't sit there saying, is it young people or old people gauging a bond rating? Because default risk is the default risk, right? But virtue is something entirely different. The reason I talked about age is this is actually from a survey that was done about what people value, and you could see the differences depending on age. Young people had different, that's the nature. It's always been there. And it's showing up in scores. So if a ESG scoring system is run by 55-year-olds, 55-year-old Europeans, you're going to probably get a very different scoring system than with 25-year-old Indians and Chinese. And do you really want to build a monument on top of a system where who's measuring the score makes that much of a difference? And the way this is shown up in actuality, there are studies that look at the correlation across ESG scores. We talked about bond ratings. You know, the correlation is across S&P, Moody's, Fitch on bond ratings. It's like 98%. I've never seen a company rated AAA on S&P and CCC on Moody's. You might get a AA, single A. But they tend to agree, and there's convergence because they're trying to measure the same thing. They agree on what they're measuring, and there's focus. Correlation across ESG scores, all over the place. You ask the services, they said it's growing pains. We're going to converge. No, you're not going to converge. Because unless you get the same group, the only way you get convergence is you all get the same type of people into your groups and you all measure it. And there is a danger of that happening. There's a self-selection here of sanctimonious young people going into ESG saying, I'm going to show the world what's right. And it terrifies them. So the convergence, if it happens, is going to happen for the wrong reasons. And even on big name companies, you get wildly different rankings across the services because of what gets weighted into the score. So here's my first hit against ESG scores. It goes to the fundamental nature. What the heck are you measuring and how can you ever get convergence? But here's some troubling features about ESG scores that you need to factor in. Do you know that as disclosures have gone up at companies, and ESG companies are increasingly required, especially in Europe with all the EU requirements, but even in the US. SEC's in fact, created this new climate change thing that you have to report. You know, as disclosures have increased at companies, ESG scores collectively have gone up. You think confessions reduce sin?
But I feel like, for example, aircraft companies, right? Confessions don't reduce sins, but at the same time, because they're confessing, they're also doing something to.
And also they know what a good confession is, right? You don't go to, I'm not Catholic, my wife is, my children have been raised Catholic, but you don't go to confession and confess in a way that the priest, and so you know what the script is, right? You know what gets you the 10 Hail Marys and what gets you eternal damnation. And you frame your confession accordingly. These are not just plain confessions, they're confessions to a script. You know how ESG scores measure scores, so you know what? You confess in a way that makes your scores higher. It's not bad or good, it's human nature, you're gaming the system. So the disclosures are, they're looking at the check boxes, and they're saying, look, we're going to disclose that because that'll improve our score. You don't think business schools do that for rankings? We know what US News and World Report looks at. They like high GPAs for the entering class, right? So I have two students, both of whom are equally qualified. In fact, one might be more qualified, but has a lower GPA. You don't think that I'm going to go with a high GPA student because it improves my rankings? I am playing the scoring game, and sometimes at the expense of doing real good. So ESG scores, as these disclosures go up, are improving across the board, which makes no sense to me. What I see from this chart is, hey, they're gaming the system better and better every year. And here's another piece of evidence. And if you look at what ESG scores are measuring, this is actually from a study that took there. You can see that they go all over the place in terms of what they're measuring. It's complete confusion about what the ESG score is actually delivering. So a couple of years ago, I made this point, you can't measure ESG. Goodness is, it's amazing how in the last 2 years, services seem to have changed their entire pitch on ESG. Now, and once in a while, I do get on a panel of somebody who runs Morningstar Sustainalytics or BlackRock's, sustainability group. They're almost like reading from the same script. They say ESG has never been about goodness. It's amazing how they rewrite history. It's been about measuring risk. And you see the story, right? Companies that score higher in ESG are less risky. And then they make up crap. So, what's the evidence for that? Well, they're less risky. So last time I was with one of these groups that measures ESG, and he claimed they're less risky. I said, okay, I do think about risk all the time. What kind of risk? He said, what do you mean, what kind of risk? I said, is it equity risk, which is risk to residual earnings, or is it risk to my contractual earnings, default risk? You could see he had never thought about this at the moment. He said, it must be default risk. I said, you're S&P, don't you have a bond ratings people who are doing that already? Is this on top of that? Is it some risk that they're not capturing, in which case I should be taking up with them? Or is it just a subset of that? And he said, no, I meant to say equity risk. I said, okay. The equity risk, is it risk of price volatility, that the stock price will move a lot? Is it my earnings? Again, it's amazing. They want to use the word risk, but they don't want to be either tangible about what risk. Since he refused to be nailed down, I took different measures of equity risk. And because I have the ESG scores, I said, okay, if your story is right, high ESG score should go with low risk. If I do a scatter plot of ESG scores against whatever measure of risk you pick, and I challenge you, I'll take whatever measure of risk you take. You know what I get? I get the exact opposite of what you're saying. You know that high ESG ranked companies are more volatile. And there's a simple reason for that, right? What kinds of companies did ESG funds load up on in the last decade? A lot of tech firms. I'm not saying this is a bad thing. I'm not going to do what ESG research is doing and draw a causality and say high ESG scores make you more risky. But you better not be using high ESG scores mean less risk. I actually had, there are these papers and the ESG research, I think, is among the most contaminated and useless research. There are hundreds and hundreds of papers in this area. This is the only area of research in business that I've seen where people use meta studies. You know what meta studies are? Rather than quote one study, they take an average of 500 studies. What is that already a diminished of? These studies are all crappy. The only way I can make them work is with the law of large numbers behind it, right? So, of course, you know, one of the things that ESG services have started using is a claim that high ESG scores give you a lower cost of capital. That's an empirical question, right? This is not a virtue question. And of course, they have a few studies that claim to back them up. People picking 100 companies, making up crap on how to get cost of capital and showing this great scatter plot. But as some of you know, at the start of every year for the last 25 years, I've been computing the cost of capital for every company in the face of the earth. I use exactly the same method every year. So started with, you know, this year I had 47,000 companies and the cost of capital for each one. And I say, okay, guys, you keep claiming that high ESG. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take the 3,000 companies ESG scores. I'm going to take my estimates of cost of capital. You can't accuse me of making up stuff because I'm using the same. Let's see what the scatter plot looks like. One of these days, I'd write that up as my next blog post, but I kind of, this is a strange space to be in. I don't want to hang out too much in it. You know what the scatter plot looked like, right? It basically would look like a shotgun blast. There's actually no relationship, even with the new versions of ESG out there, between ESG scores and cost of capital. Yeah.
Professor, I understand there are two sides of the coin, and we're
In
talking
this one, I don't think there is another side of the coin. And that's why I keep asking them, show me the other side of the coin.
my
So-
argument with the other side of the coin is it's, so again, this concept is growing, but at the same time, I feel like it's about how the resources are being used. As you were saying, that, you know, there are companies that are using, like,
And I don't disagree with you. This has always been a problem for humanity, right? So what have we over time done to stop private enterprises from using resources that create huge externalities for society? What are the, we have regulations, we have laws. You know what the ESG movement has done, right? It's taken what used to be done by regulators and governments and democracies and put it in the hands of CEOs of a subset of publicly traded companies. So I'm not arguing about the fact that resources can be misused in private enterprises going for profit. I am arguing with the way in which ESG is trying to do it. And I think it's going to create more damage than good. First, it's self-selected, right? It's not on all companies in the fossil fuel business. It's only on publicly traded companies, and even then on publicly traded companies that happen to be listed in the US and Europe. You see what's going to happen, right? You keep putting pressure on Royal Dutch and ExxonMobil. They might stop producing oil, but they're going to sell those reserves to private equity investors who are going to develop. Now, Aramco definitely is not lying awake at night and wonder what the ESG people are thinking about.
but then don't we think that even though the disclosures are only for publicly traded companies, there is that voice that goes around in
In the private
the
business,
industry?
there is no ESG score. So because your voice is captured in this one number, right? Without that number, you have no voice. So in a sense, by making it about a score, you're actually undercutting what you were trying to do. You've essentially made the pressure most significant in those companies that are scored. But those companies will tend to be publicly traded companies, and especially publicly traded companies with diverse stockholder bases, usually US or European investors. But that's not going to accomplish the end game because there's a whole set of companies that feel completely untouched by your score. Because let's face it, what's the core problem? How much of our energy did we get from fossil fuels 10 years ago, before the advent of ESG? 82%. You know how much of our energy we still get from fossil fuels? 82%. Perhaps a little higher. As long as we consume fossil fuels, what are we accomplishing by calling ExxonMobil an evil company other than make them feel shame and get rid of their resources? But guess what? As long as we're dependent on oil, and this is what the Russian invasion of Ukraine brought out, right? The hypocrisy of the whole game, because all of a sudden Germany is actually firing up its coal plants again. Why? Because they need the energy. They're dependent on oil and gas in spite of all of the lip service to green energy. The reality is that types of alternative energy that we push, which is solar, wind, and hydro, are never going to produce enough power. never going to produce enough power because we're at the mercy of nature. Nature is incapable of creating. There's one alternative energy source that had the potential. You know which one that is, right? And during the ESG phase, what happened to it? It was put on the bad side of the equation. Nuclear, bad, creates. In a sense, that's the hypocrisy in the game. Is we are dependent on fossil fuels and we can't keep calling the companies that produce fossil fuel evil companies while continuing to consume fossil fuel. And if we want to make a change here, it can't from selectively picking some companies and asking them to do the right thing. So if the answer is risk, I don't see the link yet. As I said, but normally on issues, you say, oh, what's the other side? I keep trying. For the last 4 years, I've given ESG people as much openings as I can. Say, give me a reason to believe. And the more I hear from them, the more I realize that they either haven't thought through this or they don't have a reason. So in my view, these differences in ESG scores will persist until we decide that only 25-year-olds who go through elite universities will be allowed to compute ESG scores. And God help us then. Right? Because then we're going to get a very specific view of ESG scores that reflects where those people, you're going to get a mind thing that doesn't reflect the whole world, but a very small subset of the world. And there is game. There'll always be gaming. Anytime you score something, it's almost inevitable. You've heard of greenwashing. ESG people complain. There's a lot of greenwashing. Greenwashing is a feature, not a bug, because once you start to create a system built around climate change disclosure, guess what companies are going to do? They're going to play the system. You can't complain about it as an outcome. So I'm going to show you a story that I think encapsulates how fuzzy the ESG concept. So I'm going to read the story. You can read the whole thing, but I'm going to read it in parts. And I want you to play the role of ESG people, and you're going to judge me as I go along. Feel free to judge me. I'm Philip Morris. Judge already. You said, worst company ever, right? I'm going to give away 500,000 cigarettes for free. Judge me. This is terrible. Cancer-causing product. You're giving it away for free to Ukrainian soldiers on the front line. All of a sudden, things get fuzzy, right? Ukraine is good, Russia is bad. Those poor soldiers on the front line, they could die at any moment. They need a cigarette before they die. Philip Morris. You see how goodness is situational. It depends on the point in time in history you are. No. That's why the Russia-Ukraine war brought all these issues. All of a sudden, weapons makers became good companies in the ESG. You know why? Because they were selling weapons to the right side. Nuclear power, they're re-examining. So maybe we need to take another look at nuclear power. Welcome to reality, folks. And I think, and as you look, you see more and more stories like that. So that's the ESG measure, and already you can see why I'm so suspicious of anything that flows out of it. But if you look at why ESG took off as much as it did, it promised cake without calories. It promised good stuff without giving up anything. It went to companies and said, if you're good, you'll become more valuable. Larry Fink, leading spokesperson for ESG for a while, he made that as a statement. BlackRock invests in companies that have high ESG companies. And he actually used goodness, basically, because that was the implicit message, because those companies will be more valuable, which my response is, you're either a dunce or a dupe. Because how can it be true for every company? For some companies, I can see being good is increasing your value. For some companies, it might do nothing. And for some companies, it might mean giving up on value. ESG advocates went to investors and say, if you invest in good ESG companies, you'll earn higher returns.
That's fuzzy.
Yeah. And again, it's not just fuzzy, it goes against everything we know as human beings, right? Through the history of humanity. Let me ask you a generic question. Has it been easier to be good or easier to be bad? It's easier to be bad. That's why you don't need the 10 commandments if they come naturally to us, right? It's easy. So to be good, what did you have to do? Through history, you'd have to give up something, right? The nature of being good is you got to give up something. And what was ESG promising? You can be good. Not only do you not have to give up something, you're going to get heaven right now. Right? And the history of promises like those is this is not going to end well. And finally, of course, to society, they said, this is good for society if we can make company. And that's the message that caused it to take off. And every part of that message, in a way, is questionable. So let's start with the value part. I'm going to start by asking the question, is ESG good for value? Let's look at the evidence, right? Because to be good for value, where does that show up? Remember that picture I showed you of value? It's got to show up as higher growth for good companies, higher margins for good companies, maybe less reinvestment, less risk, less failure risk. I'll give you the template, you tell me where. And I went through the research on ESG to see whether there was. So I'll give you both the good news, the bad news, and the neutral news. ESG in investing, though, is a very tricky question. To kind of understand it, let me ask you a different question. Are there some companies that are better managed than other companies? Yeah. So when you look at companies and you rank them based on management quality, you can go from best to worst, from superlative companies to abysmal companies. Now, as an investor, will you make more money investing in superlative companies or abysmal companies? It depends. You know what it depends on? What everybody else thinks about the company. If you have a superlative company that everybody else thinks is a superlative company, what's going to happen to its price? The price is going to reflect that it's superlative. And if it's just extraordinarily great, it's a negative surprise. Whether you make money as an investor depends on what's already priced in. So when I heard this argument about if you invest in good companies, you will get a higher return. From a pricing perspective, you know what you're implicitly saying. Goodness gets underpriced, and we're going to try to take advantage of it. So when I looked at the research, that's the question I was asking. Is goodness underpriced? Are we paying too little for good companies and too much for bad companies? Because if that's the case, then I can see a potential for making returns from a return to your senses. And so when you look at the excess returns, whether you can make excess returns, there is no choice but to look at what's already priced in. So I'd like you to start thinking, the last decade were green energy companies underpriced and fossil fuel companies overpriced. Because then you'd have a case for, or was it the other way around? Because the other way around, you'll actually make more money from investing in bad companies, not good ones, right? So when people talk about it, so even when people claim goodness goes with value, that's not necessarily true from an investing standpoint, because then the question is what's already priced in. So let's start with ESG and value. So that's the advantage of the template that I have, is it's my mechanism for separating bullshit from reality. I use it to kind of contest what I call the weapons of mass distraction. Words that people throw at. What about brand name? What about great management? And I go through and say, okay, what about it? Let's see where it shows up. It's an incredibly useful mechanism for dealing with people who come up with buzzwords. I said, okay. So for ESG to create value, it's got to show up somewhere over here, right? In fact, I have a proposition that some of you in my valuation class will remember, the 8 proposition. If it does not affect the cash flows and it does not affect the risk, can we please stop talking about it? And definitely stop spending on it. So that became my. So I'm going to give you, since I use the word theocratic trifecta, because so much of the push for ESG has been almost religious fervor. I decided to frame it in terms of religious outcomes. So one way to think about the ESG sales pitch is that this is the promise of heaven, that if you're good, you're going to get higher value, get higher growth, higher margins, lower reinvestment, less risk. And I could tell you a story about a company where this can happen, right? So if you ask ESG people, for examples of companies where goodness is paid, it's amazing how often one company's name comes up. It's a company called Patagonia. What does Patagonia do? It makes overpriced outerwear for guilty yuppies. I hate to insult you if you have a Patagonia jacket, but don't tell me when you spend $400 in a Patagonia jacket that you've saved the world. But that's the vision they want to leave you with. We're a great company, and they are incredibly rigid about goodness, and they will not sell in some states in the US because they don't like it. All the more power to them. It is a publicly traded company. And it's amazing how many people use Patagonia and knows very little about the company. First, do you know who the primary shareholder of the company is? The founder owns like 75%. So to begin with, it's a company with a significant insider running the company, and he's driving it based on, hey, here's what I've had. All the more power to him. Here's the second question. You know how much revenue Patagonia had last year as a company? Most people who use Patagonia as an example don't know the answer. And to my response is, please stop talking about companies as examples if you can't learn the basics. They had less than $1 billion in revenues, 800 million. Saying, so what? With 800 million in revenues, you're a niche company, right? The apparel business, it's a tiny slice. When you're a niche company, can you afford to be nobler than thou? Absolutely, because you have an audience that likes it, and this becomes your basis for charging them, basically overpricing your product, getting hefty margins. Great. In contrast, think about Nike. $40 billion in revenues. Can they afford to be nobler than thou? Absolutely not. They can't say, look, I don't agree with the way the Chinese treat parts. Can you imagine Nike walking away from China? That would be what, 20% of your revenues right there? Here's what I'm saying. If you want to be good, and that's your essence of goodness, there's a scaling limit rather than a scaling benefit. There's only so much you can grow, and you could be okay with it, right? If you're in a private business, you might say, look, I want to be good, and I'm okay being just a $2 billion company. But in a publicly traded company, you're the CEO and you say, that's what I'm going to do, you might get some pushback. Remember the French yogurt maker, Danone? The company's always had this big thing about doing good. Its CEO was its leading spokesperson for why good. You know what happened to the guy? The board replaced it because at some point in time, they said, we have a publicly traded company with shareholders. Now, you might not like to do it, but it's not your money. Remember that. You can be generous with other people's money. It's easy to do, but if it's a publicly traded company, there's a scaling limit, and you might have to accept that if you decide to go the ESG route. I'm okay with you accepting it, but don't tell me you can have your cake and eat it too. No. So when you look at the examples that are given for goodness, benefiting companies, they're almost always a small companies. They used to use Etsy as an example for the first 3 or 4 years. They don't use it anymore because it gave up its benefit corporation. And now actually if you're Etsy, you have 2 groups that you have to keep happy, right? One is you and I who shop on Etsy. What's the other? The people who make stuff on Etsy. And you can already see, you can't say, I want to keep everybody happy, because what makes one group happy is going to make the other group unhappy, right? It's the nature of making trade-offs. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but Etsy ran into that buzzsaw because it started its life as saying, we're going to keep everybody happy. Yes.
Isn't that, all of the examples that we bring up about platforms, isn't it the same for all platforms that so many users have like conflicting interests, but at the same time, they're all on the same platform?
That's different though, because if you have a conflict in different reasons for being on a platform, that's fine. But I'm not running the company for each of you. I'm running, that's why we pick focus, because if you let different people's interests play out, and I don't know what you mean by a platform, but in any entity, if you let different people's interests all drive your decision, my response is, how do you make decisions in the first place? That's why we pick one group. So in a sense, you're making my case for me. There are different reasons people buy. There are different reasons people work for you. And I'm going to try to give them a fair wage and come to an agreement or a fair product and make a transaction. But beyond that, I have to go back and say, what's my focus here? So the heaven. But if, in some religions at least, heaven as a promise doesn't keep people good, right? It's not enough of a carrot. It's interesting because not all religions do it. So what's the other threat? If you're bad, you're going to go to hell, right? And in the ESG space, that version also sometimes plays out, which is if you're bad, terrible things are going to happen to you. People stop buying your products. You're going to be hit with these extra costs. You're going to be more risky as a company. People will not buy your shares and bonds. It'll push up the price, push down the price and push up the cost of equity. So maybe that's the argument for ESG is if you're not good, it's not an argument for being good. It's an argument for not being bad. So of course, in the decade that ESG grew, that don't be bad label was particularly directed at fossil fuels. And they succeeded in some generic way. If you look at the percentage of the S&P 500 that comes from energy companies, they've become a much smaller percentage, at least leading into 2021 and 2022. Success, you push down the market cap of evil companies. We'll come back and see whether that success pays out in returns, but that was no, you're going to get punished if you're a bad company. Which brings me to a third scenario, and this is ESG advocates' hell, which is the bad guy's way. You can't rule this out, right? I don't want this to be true. We have companies like Vedanta, which is this Indian mining company, the history of not just pushing the limits of what's right, but walking over the line. That have been incredibly successful. To act like they don't exist is being in denial, right? Because here I say, look, this company does everything the opposite of what you do, and they're actually more valuable than all the good companies in the space. There's a version of Gresham's law that sometimes kicks in, which is bad businesses or bad companies drive out good companies because they're willing to cut corners and do things that you can't do. As I said, I don't want this to be true, but to act like it can never happen is nonsensical. So when we think about these dimensions that can create value, I looked at each one. So as I said, I read through about 500 papers on ESG, torturous. My objective was they were all over the place. Often the researchers didn't even know what question they were answering, basically, but I tried to take their research. And I looked at my buckets. On growth, I found almost nothing that would justify saying good companies or companies higher ESG scores grow faster. Nothing. And that didn't surprise me because that's exactly what you should expect. Yeah? On profitability, on the surface, it actually looks pretty good. You know that if you look at ESG scores and margins, in fact, there's a paper that came out of the sustainability group here at NYU, which shows that there is a positive linkage. In fact, I'll tell you statistically, here's what you do. You take ESG scores and you take profit margins, and you run a regression of margins against ESG scores, and you get a high positive correlation, and it looks like. And that becomes the basis for the finding. Look, high ESG scores lead to profit, lead to higher margins. I'm going to make an absolutely absurd statement, but you're going to see in a minute why I'm making it. Do you know that shopping at Whole Foods makes you richer? I'll back it up with data. Here's what I did. I looked at how much money people spent at Whole Foods every year and how rich they were. I ran a regression. Guess what I found? Positive, and it looks like the more you spend at Whole Foods, your independent variable. What's wrong with my logic there?
They make more money and hence they're spending.
In other words, I
more.
got the causation wrong, right? It's not spending money on Whole Foods that makes me richer. It's being richer that allows me to pay 4 times more for the eggplant because I feel organic at the moment, right? And with the ESG scores, you see what came first, profitability or ESG scores? It's not a chicken and the egg question. What concept came first? Profitability has been around as long time. You're the newcomer in the game. So when you claim that we're causing profitability, already I have a question. How did profitability get created before you came along? And even more critically, the onus is on you now to show that it's you that's changing the profitability, not creating a system of more profitable companies are able to play the game better. There's actually a way, and this is the tragedy of ESG research. There's a way in which this can be tested, right? If you believe that improving ESG scores makes you more profitable, how would you restructure these studies? What would you look at? You look at changes in ESG scores and its subsequent changes in profitability. Because if your theory is right, if my ESG score goes up, my profit margin should increase. You know what? I looked and looked and looked, and there was nothing I could see in the research that even tried to do that, which suggests to me that either these people are so they've drunk the Kool-Aid so much, or that they've already preconceived what they want to see as a solution. So when you look at profit margins, I think that you're going to get these results that look good, and much of the link between profit margins and ESG comes from the G part of ESG. And I've always wondered what the G is doing in the ESG. What's the G in ESG? Governance, right? Have we cared about governance for a long time? But the governance we've cared about in corporate finance is called corporate governance. What does it measure? How accountable are managers to shareholders? You know what the G in ESG stands for? It's stakeholder governance. It's got nothing to do with the corporate governance. You can't take research that uses corporate governance metrics and use it as backing for ESG, because in fact, corporate governance measures and stakeholder governance measures will push in different directions. So you think, why did they put the G in ESG? You are all too young to remember a time when Germany was broken up to East Germany and West Germany, right? You know what East Germany was called? German Democratic Republic. There was nothing democratic or republic about the country, but they called themselves the German Democratic Republic. Why did they do it? You read George Orwell's 1984, right? Somewhere in your lifetime, you're required to read it, even if you didn't want to. But remember, the Orwellian thing to do is to give something a name that's a direct opposite of what you're doing. It's like a George Costanza thing, right? There's actually an episode in Seinfeld where the exact opposite, watch it if you want. You give it the direct opposite. There is really no corporate governance in ESG, but they lay claim to all the good stuff from the corporate governance literature. So the profitability part, I am not convinced. In fact, I think that for some companies, you can improve margins. For some companies, it'll drop margins. In fact, you're more likely to drop margins than increase them because you got to spend money to be good, right? Eventually, it might pay off, but it might not. And as I said, these meta studies, the minute I see meta studies, my reaction is that tells me a lot about your basic research that you, I mean, in finance, we never quote a meta study. We quote a paper. You might disagree with the paper, but you say, look, this is what they found in 1970. This paper found there was a small cap premium. This paper did not. You don't take 100 small cap studies, take the average of them and say, this is why the result. That's like, I mean, the analogy doesn't go very far. It's like somebody who's 300 pounds and vastly obese, marrying somebody who's 75 pounds, who's vastly underweight, and say, on average, we're the correct weight. You're right. On average, you come out, got close to the average, but you're both in really bad shape. And with these meta studies, you have some horrifically bad studies. They're not even in different directions. That's why the law of large numbers doesn't even work for you. So the very fact that somebody quotes a meta study, you've already lost me. Now, I've also heard people. So I've taken everything I've been told by ESG people and said, is that true? And it's amazing. Every time they make a claim, you go check the numbers. You say, you know what? I don't see it. I've been told that employees are more satisfied at companies that have high ESG scores than good companies. Sounds reasonable, right? So I went to Glassdoor and I pulled up, what people at Tesla thought about, working at Tesla. And this was when Tesla was viewed as a good company. Now, of course, it might be viewed as a bad company because somewhere, as I said, goodness is situational. And what people at Ford thought. You know what? People at Ford were a little happier than people working at Tesla. You compare ExxonMobil to some green energy company. I've talked to people in Houston, ExxonMobil. They're not all in on this. Oh my God, I feel terrible. I work in a terrible company. They're okay. They've come to, you might not like what they're doing, but they've come to their own, place. So I'm okay with this. So if somebody says employees are most satisfied at companies with high ESG scores, just pull up the Glassdoor ranking, show them, say, show me. Stop making up stuff just because you talk to one person who's more happy because they work at a green company. Don't extrapolate. Some of the most unhappy people I know work at nonprofits that claim to work to make the world a better place. Talk to them if you want. It's amazing how frustrated they get because there's no focus to what they're doing, right? They came in for the best of intentions, and what they're doing is pushing paper, checking off boxes. Now I'm going to give you the one place where ESG has some evidence to back it up. There is some evidence that the funding cost for companies that score higher in ESG is lower than the funding cost for companies that score lower. But the evidence is almost all restricted to one sector, the energy sector. We've succeeded. If you're an ESG advocate, you've succeeded. You know how you succeeded? You know how much the NYU endowment fund's a tiny fund, but it's an endowment fund anyway, invests in ExxonMobil. No, in fact, you could go across the country. Almost every university endowment fund has divested itself, at least of its direct fossil fuel companies. So if you can put pressure on investors to not hold fossil fuel companies, what are they going to do? They're going to sell the stock. When you sell the stock and there are enough people doing it, you're going to push up the price, push down the price. If you push down the price, effectively you're raising the cost of equity for that company, right? And on the debt front, you have this phenomenon called a green bond, one of the greatest hypocrisies known to man. What are green bonds for? They're for green companies. In fact, when I wrote about the Adani Group, this was the most fun I had writing. What does the Adani Group do? It builds ports, it builds airports. You know how many aircraft land in Mumbai airport every day and they're coming from thousands of miles away? Do you also know that 4% of all the carbon footprint in the world is created by aircraft? It's a company that should be on the other side of the ledger, right? They're able to issue green bonds. Because they have a segment of the business that's a green energy business. This is like me running a cocaine business in my house and having a lemonade stand in my garage and saying, you know what, you're funding the lemonade stand. It has nothing to do with my cocaine business. Money is fungible. The money that goes in the lemonade stand is going to come into the cocaine business. You have no way of knowing. Stop dancing the stupid hypocritical dance. Green bonds have nothing to do with greenness. Maybe money, somebody's making money, that's the only green part of it. You're not making the world a better place. You're not reducing car. This is like people who take a long flight and then plant a tree in Oregon saying, look, I've offset my carbon footprint. No, you haven't. But there is, during the last decade, you had people lending to companies that were not fossil fuel companies at below market rates. That's basically it. There is a question to ask. When banks lend to companies at below market rates to stay as healthy banks, what do they have to do? They have to lend to other people at above market rates. I've always wondered about a system. If it comes to the government, that's different. That's taxpayer money. But if it's banks that are doing it, I'm not even sure that a bank can justify it to the other people who borrowed from it. But at least in the fossil fuel space, it looks like we pushed up the cost of capital for fossil fuel companies. But how are we doing this? By lowering the price and increasing the return on their equity, right? Do you see that if you tell the story in this part of the ESG argument, I'm going to come back to you because what's the second part of the story? You went to investors and what do you tell them? You're going to make lower return. These stories are, you got to pick which story do you want to tell? And there's nothing better than taking an ESG advocate and hoisting them on their own petard. Because you lead them in, they say, oh, this is good. You know, you lead them all the way in, and then you get to the investor section and you say, okay, you told me that the reason fossil fuel companies have higher, have a higher cost of equity is because people sold them. Now, if I'm an investor, isn't that a good thing if I'm unconstrained to buy those? You can't have your cake and eat it too. And there is another place where potentially I can see an argument for ESG. It's an argument that if you're a company that walks too close to the line, you know what I mean by the line, legal and illegal. You do the legal thing, but you're walking really close to the line. You run the risk of stepping over the line, if not by accident, somewhere along the way. And if that happens, there could be a catastrophic risk to your reputation that's so large you cannot continue as a company. You could argue that this was what happened at Valiant, the Canadian pharmaceutical company, very successful for a while, but they were doing the Monte Kelly thing, not as blatantly, and it blew up in their faces. And I'm willing to accept the argument. The argument here is not be good, it's don't be bad. Again, is this new? I mean, we've known this for a long time. We don't live in the world of robber baron corporatism that was like 120 years ago. Companies have these internal constraints, not because they want to do the right thing, but they know that if they get too close, it could blow up in their faces. And there's value. The Canadian company that built up one of the most successful, went from a $10 billion pharma company to a $100 billion pharma company, doing the Kelly thing, buying drugs that were already in patent, increasing prices. Until one day it got so big that people noticed, and then the whole, what's happened to value? First, it had to change its name. I've always told people, when a company feels the need to change its name, it's never good news. Now, what are the reasons human beings change their name? You go to the witness protection program, that might be a reason to change your name. You're trying to run away from your debtors, so you change your name. So when a company changes its name, even if it claims it's for the best of reasons, when Facebook changes its name to Meta, you spent an entire decade building up one of the most recognizable names. Why do you run away? Nothing else. It tells you about what they think about their own name, that it's become toxic enough that it's affecting their capacity to enter other businesses. Okay, I understand. And maybe that's what you get out of the ESG space is don't get toxic. Don't do things that walk too close to the line. And I actually, if you get a chance, you can go to my website. I value it after its fall from grace. And essentially I said, look, scientists are not going to come work for you. And that's basically what happened and that's why they had to change their name to Bausch and Lomb, is eventually they took a division of the company. They said, we can't go along with value. We're going to call ourselves Bausch and Lomb. So here's my basic propositions about value. First, I could say, don't be a bad company. Don't walk too close to the line, because the catastrophic, the failure risk, and it's a value argument I'm making, is what you gain from cash flows and operating risk dropping off can be overwritten by what you're doing in terms of catastrophic risk. If you want to go beyond being not being bad to being good, now we're on dangerous ground, because you ask me, should I spend more to be good? Not so sure. In fact, I'll be more decisive than that. Most of the time, do it because you want to do the right thing for society. Don't do it because it'll make you a more valuable company. And if you're a publicly traded company, then you better get in front of your shareholders and explain what you've done. I was talking to somebody and they talked about all the amazing things that Hershey is doing about sourcing its chocolates from good parts of the world. And I said, it's all great. I'm glad they're doing it. They said, why are they doing it? Because it increases their value. I said, I would love to find one person in the US who bought a Hershey's bar yesterday. Remember, these are not now high, these are, you bought to CVS, it's Hershey, but they bought Hershey's over, I don't know, Mars, because they looked at back and said, this is organically sourced, and that's why I'm buying it. I know this sounds brutal, but nobody is buying a Hershey's bar because it doesn't mean they shouldn't do it. If they do it, then they have to recognize that they're going to get the costs of doing it, that their shareholders will make less, and they might be okay with it. You might self-select and say, hey guys, you wanted the high profits, we're not delivering it anymore. You have that obligation to be transparent. Yeah.
My question is, I think along those lines, that you cannot change consumer behavior, for example, organic versus inorganic. You cannot force someone like a
No,
student.
you can. The way you do it is it's got to be regulation driven or law driven. That's one size fits all. You cannot let companies self-select and do it, because you then have a recipe of somebody else is going to come in and say, Hershey's chocolates have gotten very expensive. You know what we're going to start? We're going to start with the bare bones chocolate company that sources from the least organic parts of the world and the most damaged parts of the world. We're opening the door to the worst among us by doing what we're
It
doing.
feels like regulation was not doing enough, and this bandwagon is kind of leading towards regulation.
And I
kind
think
of
that's part of the problem, right? And I describe this as the damage that 2008 did. What did 2008 do? It destroyed our faith in institutions. We don't trust governments. We don't trust regulations. So what did we turn ourselves over to? We either turned ourselves over to crowd judgments, right? That's the birth of crypto and Bitcoin. Or we decided that CEOs of companies were so much better than there was a time when, this was not that long ago, when the CEOs of big tech companies were held up on a pedestal. We've essentially, somebody's going to be doing this. We've essentially transported what used to be done in the public space for all companies into corporate CEO. And that terrifies me. It terrifies me because do you really want, I like Jamie Dimon. I own shares in JP Morgan Chase. Do you want Jamie Dimon deciding what's good and bad for society? Do you want Jeff Bezos deciding it? Do you want Mark Zuckerberg deciding it? That's basically what we've done, right? In fact, there are a couple of people who've left BlackRock and written books. One is a guy called Tariq Fancy, and Terence Keeley books. And they're both good people. They wanted to make the world a better place, but they got increasingly the more they saw what was actually done in the name of ESG, the more concerned they got about what it means for us as a society. And they're convinced that it's actually worse for society to push down this route than doing nothing. That's actually a terrible indictment that we're actually creating a monster that's going to come back to bite us on many, and we're already paying that price in other dimensions of turning over speech to private tech companies because so I think we learned this to the hard way. So I agree with your end game, which is no, and I share your distrust, but I think in a sense that distrust is leading us to some very strange places where the consequences might be even greater than actually trusting someone to do the right thing. And finally, if your proposition is being good as the base of your business model, then be honest, that's your base. You're not doing this to being good. You're doing this because it's great PR. You're using it for an image. And I'm always caution CEOs in trying to be nobler than thou. Because when you do that, you know what you set yourself up for, right? Everybody else is looking for your weakest link, right? They're going to find it. People who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. Even if you have just glass windows, don't throw stones. But in general, don't throw stones. Not a good idea, right? So, file that away for ESG event. Yeah.
Question. So, like, let's assume, that I'm somebody that's just fundamentally interested in kind of finding out, say, if the company I'm investing in, say, straddling the line between what's legal and what's not legal. And I want information.
You want disclosure.
Yeah, I want disclosure, and that's hard to come by.
No, it's not. It's actually too easy to come by. My problem is we have too much disclosure. That's where the EU is going. It's disclosure diarrhea. Okay. I'll tell you what you're going to get. You're going to get 300 pages. Your wish is going to come true. You're going to get 300 pages on ESG in every company. And you know what you're going to do? It's not that you're overwhelmed, right? You're overwhelmed because there's big stuff, there's small stuff, there's stuff that matters, stuff that doesn't. In fact, I give people the example of this in California. We have this strange process where people can get together, they can put a proposition on a ballot. It's direct democracy, and you can change. You can change big laws, you can change tax rates. And about, I think, 1986, there was this proposition called Prop 65. Propositions have numbers that go with them. And the proposition was well-intentioned. It said, look, if you are a company that makes a product or service where any input might cause cancer, you have to disclose it. Good, right? Disclosure, so we know it. So the proposition gets passed and companies start disclosing it. And of course, whenever you have disclosure laws, you have lawyers ready to go. So companies start to get sued. And they discovered very quickly that the best way to protect themselves was by disclosing a link to cancer, even if nothing existed. I'm not kidding. If I walk into my Mexican restaurant where I live in La Jolla, and I buy a taco, there's a sign on top, there's Prop 65, says tacos could cause cancer. I said, what exactly in a taco causes cancer? It's tortilla, there's some chicken, there's some cilantro on top, maybe the hot sauce. He said, I don't know, I just put it up there because it's the safest thing to do. But here's the consequence. A few months ago, I came out and my neighbor's son was outside. He's like 19 years old, smoking a cigarette, not weed, but cigarette. I said, oh, you're smoking a cigarette? You know it causes cancer. What are you doing? He said, what's the big deal? It causes cancer. He said, everything causes cancer. Because in a sense, that's what happens when you put the big stuff and the small stuff. And that's exactly what we're going to end up with the ESG disclosure, because that's the other push. What's the big deal? We're just asking people to disclose something. You're going to get strategic disclosure, which is companies have learned if you dump everything in 300 pages, it's not that people get more informed, they actually get less informed. It's happened with the risk section in prospectuses. It happens in 10Ks. It's a nature of the disclosure
The
process.
question is slightly different, actually, which is to say, it's not so much just like the observed things that you put in, but say, for example, unobserved forms of, say, straddling line between legal and not.
But how do you disclose something that's
Yeah.
unobserved?
No,
right?
I didn't
Yeah.
mean from
Yeah.
disclosure. I'm saying as an investor, external
Okay,
party.
so name me one thing you'd like disclosure on.
Like, say, for example, I want to find out whether like the board has political connections and that might.
That's actually in the disclosures now in the US. You file a 14 def.
Mhm.
Now, you get connections, you get full background. And once you know the name of the person, the US,
Yeah.
right? Because you can't disclose it in a corporate document because you run risk of getting sued, right? You put somebody in the wrong party, you say that. So finding out about politics, do you think that the Adani Group's directors are politically connected? I'll tell you, you don't even have to do research. They are politically connected, right? So so I thought you were gonna ask something. So
No, but like my question is there a kind of, I guess, value in having sort of watched?
that's the question I'm asking. Is there value in knowing? It depends on if it's all you're disclosing is disclosing and people make their own decisions. I have absolutely no problem with it. So if you disclose your carbon footprint, there might be some people who say that's a terrible thing, I won't invest in you, and other people who say that's a good thing and invest in you because people have different value systems.
Yeah.
But you can already see that what I would ask you to disclose will be different for different companies. I don't want Facebook disclosing their carbon footprint.
Yeah.
Why am I wasting 100 pages on that? I want them disclosing about their privacy, what they're doing on the privacy front. So first, there's going to be disclosure. It's got to be focused. And it's got less is more. I don't want 100 pages. I want 5. And I want people to make their own decisions. That's independent of ESG, right? That's a disclosure argument. We can argue about what should or should not be disclosed. But to make it part of the ESG front is dangerous. Because not only then are you disclosing, you're also making a value judgment, right? So I'll throw out things like diversity, right? You're going to get disclosures on diversity. I'm not sure what statistic you're going to use, but you report that statistic. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Depends on who's looking at it, right? Which group is looking at it. You can't preach that as a sustainable analytics and this is good, this is bad. So disclosure is part of this process, but it's something that's happening on a parallel, and it's not happening in a healthy way either, just exploding out. And you're going to, I mean, trust me, in 5 years, you're going to get more disclosure than you ever wanted, and you're going to regret it.
So I guess then what's the sensible way forward then for investors who say care about things like failure risk?
No, you could find the information.
But I'm saying in the sense that if you feel like the way it's being reported, the way it's gone about, in some sense, it's not providing useful information, or even if it's providing.
I know we have the information. Here's why investors are not using it.
Yeah.
Remember A Few Good Men, this old movie
Yeah,
with Jack Nicholson, and you get to this last stage in court, and Jack Nicholson plays a general who's covered up something, you know, and the judge, the lawyer, I think it's plays it. Tom Cruise plays it, says, you know, it says, what is the truth? And finally, Jack Nicholson blows up on the stand and he says, you cannot handle the truth. If you look it up on Google, he says it much better than I do. A lot of investors don't want to handle the truth. The truth is, if you add those constraints, you have to accept the fact that you make lower returns. That's the reality, right? It's a constrained optimum. So if you really want to invest in companies, so give me whatever dimension you're worried about. I'll find you companies that meet that dimension. I'm going to give you that group and I'm going to say, this group is probably going to cost you 50 basis points, 1%, 2% on your returns. Are you okay with it? That's the part that people can't handle. You know what they want? They want disclosure that leaves them intact or actually better off. It's not going to happen. So when you look at returns, they're all over the place. It's a, it's a constrained optimal. So by definition, a constrained optimal cannot be an unconstrained optimal. And ESG didn't invent this space. You heard of the Anna Domini Fund? It used to be a fund from about 40 years ago. It was a fund that invested based on Catholic principles. It was marketed, obviously, primarily to Catholics. And here's the fund, and you got to give them credit. They said, we invest in this fund, we're going to constrain ourselves to investing only in companies that meet our set of Catholic precepts for good companies. And by the way, if you do that, you're probably going to give up 0.5% or 1%. We'll try to minimize how much you give up. But in return for doing that, you're going to get to go to heaven. That's a package that as a Catholic people bought into. Islamic finance. You know what? They invented ESG well before ESG was even an acronym in anybody's right? Because they had a vision of good and bad based on, and it governs how people invest in some parts of the world. And TIA-CREF, which is my choice when I put my pension fund, actually has run this fund called Social Choice Equity Fund, which predates ESG. And the reason I picked that fund is they actually, in their prospectus, tell you that the fund, so they're explicit about the fact that you're going to get less. If this is how ESG had approached us from the beginning, I'd have much more respect for the space, which is, hey, you want to be good, it's good for society. We'll have the disclosure, we'll pick returns, but by the way, you can't have your cake and eat it too. It might mean in the long term that you settle for 30. We'll try to minimize that drag, but don't gaslight me. I just started using the word, I think I like it, so I'll keep using it. By telling me that I'm going to do all of this constraining and still deliver a higher return. So if you look at the research on the relationship between ESG and returns, not surprisingly, it's all over the place. There's a lot of research that suggests that investing in bad companies delivers higher returns. And it's actually very believable because they're bad, you cut them off. No. There's some research on investing in good companies, and I'll show you the backing for that research, but it's actually on the surface because it's almost because the types of companies you pick and the decade you're looking at that you get this outperformance. And of course, there are some studies that find that ESG has no effect on returns. So that's why I said it's all about pricing. If it's already priced in, then investing in good companies. In fact, I can visualize a scenario where being good increases your value, but it's actually a terrible investment because if I price it in too high. So without bringing the pricing part into the discussion, it's almost about, is this good for investors? So the pricing effect to me is where this discussion should go. So when I hear a BlackRock argue, don't tell me ESG is good for value. That's why I said what Larry Fink was saying was bypassing the key question. Show me that not only that value is not being priced right, and that you as BlackRock think using ESG scores to deliver, because then I can hold you accountable. So it's a pricing effect. What's priced in, what's priced in. And that's why I said you start thinking about what do you think was mispriced in the last decade? Was it fossil fuel companies or was it green energy companies? Because you now have a way of saying, hey, you know what? I don't think goodness is underpriced. In fact, in some segments, we might be overpricing this carbon footprint issue. And that means I'll make more money investing in fossil fuel companies than in green energy companies. So the way this has played out in the investment arena is it's played out either as what's called inclusionary investing, where people actively go out and look for good companies, high ESG score companies, or exclusionary, where basically you take out companies that basically you think are bad companies. Which you think is easier to do? It's easier to go the exclusionary route than the inclusionary route. And to show you why funds like it so much, BlackRock has this fund called the Carbon Transition Readiness ETF. That sounds fancy, right? You want to care about climate change, that's a fund you want to be in. The Wall Street Journal actually compared it to just a standard ETF, and it found that the Carbon Transitions ETF and a standard ETF had 497 out of the 500 stocks for the SEC. Took 3 stocks out, did a little finagling with the weights. So basically, they're doing very little. But here's the big payoff. The expense ratio is 3 times higher on this carbon transitions fund than on a typical fund. People are making money on ESG. You're not doing anything for climate change with that carbon transitions fund. But when you see an ESG fund, that's what the subtext is. Now, incidentally, if you ask, for much, they have stopped doing this because the graphs don't look as attractive anymore. For a long time, the big pitch for ESG was I'd see go to sessions and people would put up, ESG scores and returns, and they go over the decades and look, ESG companies with high ESG scores deliver higher returns. Much of this research came from the last decade. Why? Because ESG wasn't invented. So how do you explain the fact that it looks like high ESG scores have high returns? We kind of know already because we kind of laid the foundation. What is it that explains that thing? The bulk of the last decade, ESG was primarily focused on climate change, avoiding fossil fuel companies. In fact, not just fossil fuel companies, any company with a big carbon footprint. And I'll make a statement up front, a manufacturing company will always have a bigger carbon footprint than a service company. And a service company will have the biggest carbon footprint than a technology company. So guess where ESG ended up being focused on for much of the last decade? It was in tech companies. Almost all of the excess returns get removed once you take away the tech focus. And in fact, the market did it for them, right? By doing what? We went from the last decade where tech companies ruled the roost, to all of a sudden over the last 2 years, you're seeing fossil fuel companies do well. So the other thing is you're catching a decade where things moved in your favor, but the problem is things, markets give, markets take away. You're building this on a mirage. Of course, you're going to have decades where you do better and decades you're going to do worse, but across time. And on green bonds, the sheen is starting to come off, right? You can start to see people see the hypocrisy in this space. And I think that the Adani group is just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, you start looking at who has issued these green bonds. I mean, it's quite clear that there's nothing, there's no greenness being advanced.
It's
Yep.
just about banks willing to invest in companies, but trying to find a greenwashed way to do so.
And I think the problem is, if you do that, there's a cost for somebody else. If you're actually issuing these bonds at below market rates, you're increasing cost for everybody. So let's be open about who else is paying more. So maybe that housing that you're complaining is not getting built is because that guy can't borrow the money because the bank is too. So I think there's always consequences. So again, let me give you glimmers of hope. That's all I can offer you in this space. In terms of glimmers of hope, there is this transition period where the company that's being hurt from being bad is trying to be good. So a company that's walked too close to the line is trying to fix itself. You could argue that in that transition period, if you get ahead of the game, you can take advantage of the race. And some activist investors who are ESG focused have tried to do this. They target companies that are badly behaved. And they believe that bad behavior is actually leading to lower value. And they push these companies to change, not because they're interested in the globe, but because they want to make money. The examples are far and few, but there are these, that's your. So investing bottom line is it's, if you're declaring victory that ESG is good for returns, it's not just way too early. It's never going to happen. Once the numbers come in, I can almost guarantee you that adding a constraint is just going to mean lower returns. And I think that the biggest problem with ESG is they're so busy selling it and framing these ideas, they're trapped in their own device. Here's why a BlackRock can never come out and say that adding an ESG constraint is going to lower your returns. Why can't it say that? What does BlackRock invest in? Pension fund money for states and companies. It's a fiduciary responsibility, right? And those people haven't bought in. So if you're going to do this, you almost have to carve out the portion of money where people say, I'm okay with it. And so as you watch these ESG kind of devolve into this political food fight between red states and blue states, that's basically what you're seeing playing out is, and the reason BlackRock has gone strangely silent on this is they know they have a legal problem on their hands that they better clean up on, because it could blow up. This cuts to the core of their business, right? You have a fiduciary responsibility, and this would be a violation of that fiduciary responsibility unless you get buy-in. The disclosure part, right? This is coming. It's coming not just in the US, it's there in Europe already, right? You've got to disclose this, you've got to disclose that. And the problem is the disclosure requirement is happening. So when you look at disclosures, though, you've got to recognize that disclosures, you're going to get the gaming, right? You're not getting information, you're getting gaming information. And I hate to go back to the religious base, but disclosures strike me as analogous to confessions. If you're Catholic, you go every Sunday, you confess your sins. If you believe confession leads to more virtuous people, then that's good. But what if confession becomes this way of you cleansing your soul so you can sin again? I have a feeling that a lot of disclosure is going to be companies confessing and saying, now I can go back to sinning again. So we'll see that happen because that's been the history of disclosure. So requiring companies to disclose more information is not automatically going to make them better. It might just mean that there's more noise in the game, more pages to read through and actually less information, because that's basically what's happened in corporate governance. Yes.
An example of confess and then sin again is, for me, it's carbon offset. Like I don't understand that Like, I don't understand.
that's really playing off your guilt, right? That's basically what they're doing. They're playing off your guilt, and the businesses that have made money playing off your guilt are among the least scrupulous businesses I've ever seen. Now, they promised to plant a tree in Oregon, but have you ever visited that tree to see how it's doing? You don't. So you know what they do? They promise that you're going to create this green area somewhere in Brazil. You're not going to go to the rainforest of Brazil to check your green area. You don't even know what part of the green area is yours anyway. There's a lot of fraud in the space that they're taking advantage of. So that's not even confession, that's just guilt. And that's the other Catholic emotion that's been played on. If you're guilty, there comes the box. Just put in a little more money and you'll feel. So that's the other analogy in church and in every religion. One way you make yourself feel better again, you know what? Just put more money in the collection plate this week. I feel a lot better now. So I think that in general with disclosure, I tend to be a cynic because I've seen how this game has evolved. Not just in ESG, but across. Now, you got to take the risk profile section, right? Legalese. You read and say, who the heck wrote it? The answer is pretty simple. It's a lawyer, and when lawyers write things, the objective is not to inform, it's to confuse. You don't even know what he said, but they'll say it in like 15 lines. And second, as human beings, and this is well established in behavioral finance, we hit a point of overload. What does that even mean? At some point, we stop processing information. And you know what we go back to? Very simplistic rules of thumb. Look at how many people still invest based on, oh, the price earnings ratio looks low. You see, why are they doing it? Because they're drowning in so much information. They're going back to some simple rule of thumb because it makes a complicated world look simpler to them. And finally, let's face it, a lot of this disclosure, this confession place is to get a shield. Some of the biggest scams in the last decade, as a front, have maybe not used the word ESG, but used goodness as a front. Yeah. In fact, I call this the runaway story. Young companies that come out, and here's what the ingredients of the story are. First, there's a charismatic, likable storyteller. Second, they're telling a story about disrupting a business you don't like. And third, they're putting a societal spin, will make the world a better place. Sounds abstract, but let me tell you a story about a 19-year-old woman who drops out of Stanford and starts a blood testing business. Any of you love the blood? Have you ever been to Quest Lab in the recent past? This is like a nightmare, right? It takes you 6 weeks to make an appointment. They take 2 buckets of your blood. They don't tell you it's for 6 weeks. So she's so charismatic, likable narrator, telling a story about disrupting business. And she also said that in the process, she was going to give these blood tests away for free to parts of the world where people couldn't afford. She was going to save the world. And what happened? The company she created, Theranos, ended up with this VC estimate of pricing of about $9 billion or $10 billion on a test that nobody really asked question, does your blood test work? You know why? Now, after the fact, in October of 2015, after it all blew up, somebody, I decided to write a post on it because everybody was sure that if they had been there, they'd have asked the question, does your blood test work? I said, let's suppose it was June of 2015. Elizabeth Holmes is actually in New York giving this talk to a huge group of people. The people who brought their daughters in because they wanted to see, a billionaire who wasn't a social media influencer who would grow, that you too can do this. I said, would you have had the courage at that meeting to put up your hand and ask the question, does your blood test work? And this isn't the first one, right? The FTX guy, Sam Bankman-Fried, what was his altruism? I forget now. It was such a crappy idea. I've let it slip out of my mind. Effective altruism, something like that. He said, this business is about giving back to society. It's effective altruism. It's kind of bullshit we let people get away with. And if you get a chance, read the Adani groups, go to their website. It's a greenness is good or something. It's right up there. They're ESG company. Well, I'm not saying every company that pushes ESG is somehow committing fraud. But in my experience, in my life, when I've met good people, they never tell me how good they are. I never saw Mother Teresa get in front of a group. I grew up with Mother Teresa, still very active. I never heard her say, I'm a good person. You know how we knew she was a good person? She did good things. Whenever somebody spends a lot of time telling you how good they are, I don't know about you, but I'm a cynic. Actually, you must be hiding some really bad stuff if you're spending 15 minutes telling me how good you are. So last piece, the payoff to society, right? Because that's the ultimate fallback. It's not good for companies, not good for investors, it's good for society. And I've kind of talked about this all the way through, but there is this law of unintended consequences. You put pressure on companies to get out of bad spaces, but you still need those bad spaces. You're still dependent on fossil fuels. Problem is not going to go away, it's just get pushed behind the curtain. And I talked, and fossil fuels is a perfect example of this, right? Because in US and European oil companies, you've seen the pressure. But here's what they don't tell you. That fossil fuel reserve that you got Royal Dutch and Exxon Mobil to get rid of is going to private equity investors. $1.5 trillion invested in this space. Let me ask you a question. Would you rather have Exxon Mobil develop your oil reserves or Carlyle develop your oil reserves? You've taken your money out of hands of companies. We have at least a semblance of a chance and moved it behind the table. I make a prediction. If we keep labeling fossil fuel companies as evil, you know what they're going to do? They're going to go private. They don't care. It's not like they're dependent on capital. They don't need the capital. They're self-fulfilling. They're going to go private. You're going to lose the ESG score, but guess what? The fossil fuels are still being developed. There you go. One of the dirtiest oil patches in the world. Removed from the public company space, but now held by private equity investors. It's still pumping out oil. So if you want to hide behind this is good for society, at least have the honesty to say, is it actually changing society? In fact, I'm going to argue by letting ESG enter the space, we've slowed real debates about climate change. Because in a sense, what are governments doing? They're saying, oh, the companies are doing it. We're not going to have to act. They'll take care of the problem. It's a very insidious process because we've laid the foundations for essentially even worse behavior. Which leads to the final question, and this is something that every one of us has, right? I want to be good. I want to change the world. That's the emotion that ESG tapped into, is every one of us wants to change the world. This is why people take ESG courses in business school, because it offsets the guilt that you're being focused on mercantile and mercenary things. And you say, look, I take it. But it draws on the human emotion. So how do I do that? Well, I think, the old saying, charity begins at home, applies in the space. Right? So if you want to be good and you start a business, by all means, you want to give away half your wealth or half your income every year to have scholarships for kids who can't afford to go to college, because that's what you think the defining problem is the education mismatch leading to wider and wider wealth differences. You should, it's your money. But if you are the manager of a public company or CEO, you don't have that luxury. It's not your money. So first, don't go work for companies then where you're essentially having to put your conscience in a box and hide it away in the morning before you go to work, and then take it out of the wherever closet you took at the end of the day. Here's the problem though. ESG people think they invented virtue in 2008. Were people virtuous before 2008, or were they like barbarians going around ripping each other up? Yes, a couple of days ago, I gave this talk at Baruch College, and I gave it in a building named the Bernard Baruch building. Bernard Baruch made his money in markets. He was money in, money out, as completely focused making money. And then what did he do? He gave his money to City College. It allowed them to create where thousands of students go through at probably a discounted fee relative to NYU. Bill Gates, Warren Buffett. 40 years ago made a giving pledge. You know what the giving pledge is, right? While they're living, they're going to give away 95% of their wealth. Here's the difference though. Before ESG, those decisions were made at the individual level. People decided how much they were going to give away and who they were giving away to. You know what ESG wants to do? It's to arrogate that responsibility to sustain analytics or CEOs of companies. So it's not that there's going to be more virtue, it's who's dishing out the funds. And I'm not sure this is healthy to take the decision out of your hands and my hands and put in the hands of Jamie Dimon. If you want to do good, you got to start at home. So if you feel the climate change, don't order stuff from Amazon to begin with those boxes. So what are you going to do with them? You got to make decisions that reflect that you truly care in what you consume, what you invest in. So if you feel that a company is a bad company, of course you shouldn't invest. This has nothing to do with ESG. You got to live with yourself. It's kind of tough to live with yourself if you don't like yourself, right? But also it goes beyond that. We can distrust governments, we can distrust regulators, but if we truly want to make a change, we've got to refine at least some trust in them. I find too many 25 to 30-year-olds disconnected from politics, disenchanted. They've given up. I understand. But if you give up on that, you've essentially given away the tools you need to make the change that you complain is not happening. You got to re-engage. You got to re-engage at the community level. You got to re-engage in politics. You got to so if you don't like, you got to, because that's the way change is coming. It's not coming from sustained analytics putting a score on a company. It's definitely not coming from Larry Fink telling you that goodness is good. It's going to increase value. It's coming from your choices. Now, my final piece on ESG, and I probably should regret these words, but I don't. I said, look, if you continue to be in this space, I'm going to put you into one of two groups of people. One is you're a useful idiot. You think you're really changing the world and you toil in the ranks, or you're a feckless knave. You know this is not going to make a difference, but you're making a ton of money. So whenever I run to people with ESG in their titles, and of course they don't like this, I scan them. Are you a useful idiot or a feckless knave? There's no middle ground here. And a lot of academics working in this space are more useful idiots that don't have the capacity to be feck. They don't have enough feck. No, so I guess they can't be feckless. So, but a lot of people are making money in this space. The McKinsey's ESG group, the BlackRock ESG funds. I mean, I can't think of a reason why I shouldn't put in the feckless knave space. So I know that sounds harsh, but this, what makes it different from a lot of business ideas get oversold, people make money. What makes this difference is the virtue cover that you used to push this on me. And I think that's both unfair and it was bad for you as a concept because you got no pushback because people were afraid, they were intimidated. No, I am beyond caring, so I'm going to continue to speak up. And it's something that I would like you to actively push back on because you and your classes where people will get up and just make up crap. Don't let them get away with it. And that includes me. So if somebody says things like higher ESG scores, give you lower cost of capital. Just show me the evidence. Then probe it. Don't let them say, oh, let me give you a paper that shows that. That's not good enough because papers can, I've done research. I know how you can take data and make it sing your tune. You need to have that pushback to get this on. And trust me, ESG will pass on because these concepts hit the limits of their emptiness. But it's going to get replaced by some other buzzword because this is before ESG, it was called CSR. This is something that I've encountered through the last 50 years. It keeps changing acronyms. So that's it. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry I kept going, no break, but no. It's